not bad literature, actually.
Yes.
Actually, this is a funny thing. A lot of the books that didn't make it into the Bible are outstandingly bad literature.
Some of them are.
Yeah.
Hmm.
The really top the best expressed ones were the ones that made it in by the looks of things. But essentially, what was Christianity when it started off? Let's say the stories are true, Luke is right, and Jesus and John the Baptist were very closely associated back
Hmm.
in, well, Luke claimed 29 AD, but what was that movement all about? You tell me.
Well, I wasn't there. And so I'm perfectly happy to say I don't know. We're just modeling historically what we think might have happened.
Well, compared as is expressed in the gospel, as compared to the normal religion at the time, which Jesus and perhaps even John ran into trouble with, the normal religious authorities, we're dealing. I'll present you with a shocking category. It was a doomsday cult. It was
Christianity?
preaching, huh?
Christianity is
Started as a doomsday cult. It was preaching the end of the world. That was the whole business.
That's one of
They
the
were
big.
literally, this is a few places in the Bible, they were predicting Judgment Day. The Jews who followed the Pharisees believed in the occurrence of Judgment Day was going to come up at some point and we'd all be resurrected in the flesh and the world would be made straight. And John is preaching, make your ways straight because, well, the end of the world is nigh. Forget your money, forget making your money and all your other pursuits. It's all pointless now. Anytime soon, Judgment Day is upon us, and the most important thing you can do is purify your sheets so you end up on the good team rather than the bad team.
so it was
It's
just about, go ahead, sorry.
you go on, Sharon. Yes.
So it was just about the way I see it, early Christianity was about upsetting the status quo.
Uh,
That's why I think they got rid of him. It was a fulfilling of prophecy, but the chief priests and scribes thought Jesus was an upstart.
So this all seems like a good time to actually dive in because this is a major what you're talking about, Stephen and Sharon, is kind of one of today's major topics. Is what was it like in the beginning and how did it transform over time? So I'll do our usual intro for the recording and the live stream and for any folks who are new. Welcome to week 171 of the Kenneth Smith Seminars Millennia in Microcosm arc. We are in a section of the book Millennia in Microcosm that is about medieval civilization. It's about the medieval worldview, the medieval perspective, medieval history, how it arose and rose and flourished, and then how it decayed and was replaced. And this is a multi-year arc. We already finished a multi-year arc about the ancient world, which is how Millennium Microcosm begins with its chapter 4 that in which Kenneth in in one extremely dense chapter manages to cover, an incredible amount of history, kind of trying to characterize the worldview of the ancients and how alien it is to our worldview, how different. What are the points? This is the point of this book, Millennium Microcosm. What are the points of disagreement in which an ancient Athenian or Spartan would see the world radically different than the way we do? Not worse than we do, different than we do. What was their value proposition? What did they think was the purpose of life? How did they think God and nature and man related to each other? The differences between in those things between how they saw the world and how we see the world, Kenneth Smith argues, is not a matter of we're the best and they're obsolete. Says that's the self-congratulatory way that moderns like to explain history. They all sucked, but they gradually got better and eventually they became us and we're the best of all. He says this is obviously propaganda. It's ideology. It has nothing to do with the ebb and flow of agency and contingency across time. It has everything to do with positioning, supposedly being at the end of history, which some propagandists have actually come out and said, history's over now. We're in an eternal present, and our million-year modern epoch will never end. It'll just go on forever. And in response to that, as an existentialist philosopher, Kenneth Smith postulates in this book, Millennia and Microcosm, that each epoch of history has its own perspective, its own value system, its own interpretive framework that massively warps the way it sees the world. And that warpage accomplishes two things. It means there's certain kinds of things that are important to that epoch that those people will notice more clearly than other people can notice them, because to other people, those things aren't as important. But it also means that the things that aren't as important to those people, they're more likely to overlook, to not notice at all, or to misinterpret if they see it. And he says that applies to the ancients, it applies differently to the medievals, but it also applies to moderns. We have our blind spots, the things that we can't see clearly. We have our distortions, the things we characteristically misread. And we have our advantages, which we talk about endlessly. What are the things that we can see more clearly than others? But we don't like to talk about the other part of it. He says that functions as a trap for us. It prevents us from understanding the world because we don't understand ourselves. We have no distance to look back on ourselves from. So in this book, he takes us through three epochs and spends time getting us to really get inside the heads of the leading thinkers of that age, to see the world the way they saw the world, so that we can add that to our toolbox. So that when we want to understand a situation, we aren't always stuck looking at it from the modern perspective, with the man with the hammer with a single tool who thinks every problem is a nail. We can instead have a toolbox that has at least 3 different tools in it. And we can try applying each one of them and seeing how the condition, the situation that we're considering changes, depending on whether we look at it the way Aristotle would, or the way Thomas Aquinas would, or the way that Locke or Hume would. And these shifting perspectives help us to see more clearly the complexity of nature and give us some, for the first time, they give us some freedom of thought and freedom of how we want to develop as people. We stop just being a symptom of our ideology and our past education. So we are halfway roughly through the medieval civilization section. And this is in some ways the most important epoch. And it is the most neglected. Typically in the 18th, 19th, 20th century, they would teach the ancient world, the Greeks and the Romans, and then they would skip over the next 1,000 years and pick up again with the Renaissance. And the argument was, oh, that was just a dark age of superstition and violence. So we don't have to know about that. But Kenneth says, that is a deeply stupid thing to do. It's ideological. It says, because in the ancient world, we know how it ended, but we don't know how it began. It began before people were writing things down, before the cultures involved were writing things down. And so it can't tell us about the origins, the rising stage, the revolutionary stage of an epoch. And in the modern world, we're all about the revolutionary stage. Look at us. We overthrew ignorance. We're an age of enlightenment. We're bringing freedom and goodness. We get the beginning, but we don't get the end, which is why we keep telling ourselves this will just go on forever and it'll be fine. And we misunderstand the modern age, particularly in our failure to see that it will have an ending, and therefore to figure out what kind of ending it might have. Only the medieval epoch do we know the beginning and the middle and the end of the story. And he says, so this is why we must not neglect it. By studying, as we've been doing, the revolutionary period, which is kind of what we're still talking about, the early theology, the rise of Christianity, we can see how it became a revolution in values, what Nietzsche calls a transvaluation of values, in which every single important term, free will, determinism, God, nature, man, character, you name it, if it was important, politics, what are these things? They took all the definitions the ancient world had and they turned them all on their head. They inverted the value proposition. They became, from a value system perspective, an alien people to whom the ancients would eventually not understand medieval arguments at all. And eventually, after the revolutionary period, the medievals would become unable to understand the ancients and thus would read Plato and Aristotle only as lead-ins to their own glorious epoch and not be able to see how they actually differed from them. So this is important for us. because then we can look at our own era and see how do we misunderstand the medievals in a similar fashion. All of this comes from Hegelian existentialist um, philosophy of history. And we are in, I'm going to call on Ari in a second, but in short, we are the chapters in Millennia Microcosm that are about medieval civilization start with chapter 5, go on for, I don't know, 8 to 10 chapters. And we're in chapter 8, which is 5, 6, 7, 8, the fourth in the sequence. And we are nearing the end. And today we probably won't end today. We'll probably end next week, but we're nearing the end of this. And for those who just joined us who wonder if they're going to be lost, we go through this very carefully, a sentence at a time. We analyze what he's talking about. A lot of what he's doing as a philosophy professor is pointing to other sources. He points to Mark, he points to Hegel, he points to Nietzsche, he points to Arendt. And so we take our time with it and we go follow up on those pointers and say, what are those people talking about and how does it relate to the current discussion? So we'll be able to recapitulate some things that you've missed. As you have questions, feel free to raise them. Starting with Ari, who has his hands up. Ari, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind, sir.
So good to be here. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I have a question, and of course, as a question, there's a bit of a soliloquy to sort of describe it, give a bit of context. But the question is pretty straightforward, which is, oh, yes, we're saying there, of course, there's these made-up ideas that we're saying is a fiction. So we're buying into our own fiction that there's an ancient era, a medieval era, and a modern era. Of course, these are constructed ideas, not really real things in nature, but they're just things that we've chosen. But even so, let's pretend for the moment that those are really three distinct actual eras as opposed to just social construction. I was sort of thinking about it like in other stages of biology or development, that like for instance, a human being has the phase of being a child and then maybe either a man and then an old man, or an adolescence and then a man or woman in this case too. But I'm just saying man is human and women are men. So just not to be too sexist, but for the sake of easy in language, that um, like for instance, you would say biological will mark the difference between childhood and adolescence, let's say with puberty. And we can there are specific hormones or something to signals that we can see that, oh, that guy's getting hair on his armpits. That means he is transforming from a child to, right. We can see it with a physiological, like a fact, an event. Um, so the idea is, and I think we've covered this to some degree a bunch in previous sessions when we were ending the ancient era. We're asking like, how do we know the ancient era has ended, and how do we know the medieval era started? And we seem to agree that there was a lot of gray area and a lot of um, this one is dying while this one is being born, and there's overlap, and it's confusing and it's complex, so it's not reducible in the first place so easily, and we wouldn't even try. So I get that, and I love seeing as an event. It feels like some sort of alignment with the Roman Empire. That once Rome was gone, that was like a real cue to everybody else that the ancient world is gone. But I think that also might just be my modern um, baggage that I've smuggled in. Is that really true? Would someone in like, I'm imagining some guy in China 800 AD or something, hears for the first time that Rome is gone, would he be like, "Oh yeah, that's it. The world has changed now. We're definitely in a new era"? Was it like, would it have meant something like that to them to know that Rome is gone means that they're in out of this? I would of course call it ancient versus medieval, but they would know. They smell the whatever's happening. They would know that the tide has changed. Whatever you'd say, that they could see the change as well as we could. I don't know. But from our perspective, how do we demarcate when the ancient era really died and when the medieval era started? And then similarly, which I'm more interested in, is when does the modern era start and the medieval era really die? There's lots of course, possible debate on this that we could get stuck into. But from a general principles point of view, rather than saying specific things, right? Rather than look at specific events like, oh, this is when Jesus existed or when, Martin Luther made his theses. I like the idea of at least exploring which it can be more generalized and at least agreed upon, but it loses accuracy because it is this idea of what Sharon was saying in this idea of status quo being really um, shifted. Like I would say that you have an era, like a signal, it's constant for a long time, and then all of a sudden we agree around this time there's a serious status quo change, and then say that marks the new period, right? That could be a good way of looking at it, and so we could then decide which we think is the most important causal mechanism rather than just a trigger for what caused the disruption in the status quo. Like the idea is to some degree, like the like I'm five version that has to work is like, oh yeah, Rome is gone. Well, Rome is gone is good enough to say that the ancient era is over, right? That works for me to some degree in a very, very, if I had to explain this to like a kindergartner and still have something that I believe is essentially true, even though it misses, most of the information. But I was wondering similarly, if and when are we going to start talking about the medieval era in terms of its own story, like
Yeah.
it's its own mythos,
Yes.
and therefore we could then actually identify these demarcations, both what I was trying to say, both noetically and gnostically. Like we could approach, like right now, I would say, let's say in our own era, it feels very from, I would say from a gnosis point of view, that the era is changing. We're no longer in the modern era that I grew up with in, let's say, 30 years ago in the 90s. I would say that gnostically it feels very differently, and I'd also say noetically, like logos versus mythos, the story of the world has definitely changed, and then the details of that story, all the information, all the technology, like the internet and AI, has drastically changed from an idea point of view, from a logos point of view, that we're in a new era, so to speak. And I was thinking like we could, and I bet Kenneth already does this. He looks at, and maybe I'm already just I'm just way behind. You guys have been doing this whole time, and I haven't really been realizing it. Is that Kenneth is showing us from a logos point of view and a mythos point of view when these eras sort of changed and how they changed and then what they look like. But he's giving us this mythos point of view and a logos point of view. And in general, he's giving us more than that too, but he's trying to build like a multifaceted dimensional approach. But I was just thinking from do we care? Maybe I'm just going on my own and I'll like I'm sure I need to anyways. But quickly, like when and where do these things happen? And how did we decide that was a when and a where? Right? Like how did we decide that the modern era is started or the medieval era is started or we're in the high era? If you want to get into that, like how in the high era, is that because of this stuff with Latin that changed, the gold and the silver or whatever? We agreed that the language changed. I'm also referencing previous conversations for other people who haven't heard some of this stuff. But I was just wondering, like, is it worth even taking almost a good time if people are interested in what would be the metrics?
Yes.
How would we decide from a metric point of view or some sort of semi-objective point of view, something that seems logical to decide that the status quo is really changing here and in this way, right? I think this would be useful for our purposes.
I agree.
Because it's sort of, it describes the water maybe now in terms of hydrogen bonding with oxygens and hydrogens, right? That would be much more helpful if we could identify some underlying structure.
Yes. So we'll talk about
But maybe
that.
that's just me. I'm not sure if anybody else is interested in that.
No, I mean, especially for the folks who haven't been on the calls before, this is the right thing to talk about as we're summarizing what this is about. So we'll do that. I'll do that in just a moment, but first I'm gonna ask Sharon to come off mute and tell us what's on her mind.
I have a question. Even in today's world in which we're living, where the status quo is changing, I hear what Ari is saying. Is there ever a definitive point, or it's just a gradual spectral change? I hear what he's saying, and I'm trying to wrap my head around it. because we went from ancient to medieval, and the predominant factor in the medieval time was this adoption of Christianity, not so much as a spiritual tool, but as a political tool.
Yes.
Right? And I think David's lead in today really emphasized the political nature of it with the emphasis on heaven and hell.
Yes.
That's the reward and the punishment. The spiritual essence was lost, but that took thousands of years to establish that, I think. You know, so what I'm asking is, the question I'm asking is that, and I hear Ari saying that we need to have some definitive point. I think it's and please correct me, I'm not a history student, but historically, it just seems like a gradual emergence.
Yes.
Am I saying that? Am I expressing that well?
Yeah, and I can build on that and be more specific in a way that answers both of your perspectives. I mean, I've spent a bunch of time looking at kind of Kenneth's take on this and the Hegelian take on this. So I think I can do justice to what his position would be, and it's that, you know, the existentialist philosophical position on history takes for granted the Greek proposition that nothing is just an object, right? So an epoch of history is not just you've got a date line and then you draw, you know, a start at the beginning and you draw a start at the end and say, there, that's the epoch. It never works that way. And it doesn't work that way because these are living organisms. The model that we use is of a living organism. And living organisms arise from previous conditions, and they unfold new order from within themselves over time. And so the result of that is that they're, first of all, constantly changing, right? Panta re, Plato says about Heraclitus's proposition. All things flow, all things change. And if all things are flowing and changing, then it isn't the case that you go from a status quo to a change and then back to a status quo. Instead, you've got changes before the moment that you want to draw the line on, but you've got changes continuing after the point at which you want to draw the line. It's not simple. And so the Hegelian take on this is that the roots of the new system are already growing in the late phases of the previous system. And the more fruits and seeds from the old system continue to develop after the new system is in place. And one of the ways that he says that is what we take for typical American culture is a melange or a mosaic made up of not just modern fragments, you know, the dignity and rights of man and freedom and all that, but also medieval fragments. Look, for example, our corporations are basically medieval fiefdoms, right? It's economic feudalism in many ways, and ancient fragments that are still around 2,000 years later and still influence people, not just in stories or in art, but, you know, in people's sense of, you know, that when Martin Luther King Jr. says, you know, I dream of a world when my children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That focus on ethos as the central concern of what it means to be a good human being, that's pre-modern and it's pre-Christian. That is ancient. That is almost the classic summation of Aristotle's position or Plato or Heraclitus's position. You know, that ethos is everything. And we're going to talk about that today when we do our discussion on Q. So first of all, Sharon, you're right that there's not a line that you can draw. But there are multiple points that happen where you can look at the before and after and go, wow, that was a change. And what happens during these revolutionary periods is they accumulate in a landslide over a period of a century or two. Usually, there is just this huge tidal wave of revolutionary changes, and they all add up to the fact that before that 200-year period, the people saw the world and organized their affairs radically differently than they do after that 200-year period. There's usually, you know, an era that you can point to, and you can often hang a date on there for convenience, as long as you remember that date isn't a wall, that, you know, everything's growing through that time. So I'll give you some examples from Rome. It's from the end of the ancient era that just help to make things clear. So first of all, before the fall of Rome, everybody in Europe who was part of the Roman Empire was paying taxes. They were paying tribute through the governors to Rome. Rome was collecting this river of wealth from all over the continent, all over the Mediterranean, Asia, West Asia, North Africa, and all over Europe. But after the fall of Rome, nobody was paying tribute to governors. There was no flow of money going to Rome. That whole economic engine that was driving the ability of Rome to pay for the world's largest professional army, which was then patrolling the boundaries of Rome and trying to grow it or fighting back against barbarian invasions, that whole system collapsed. And it made an enormous difference in people's immediate lives. Everybody wrote about it at the time. I mean, everybody. The Britons wrote about it, the Italians wrote about it, Spanish wrote about it, Syrians wrote about it. Everybody talked about, oh my God, we like, I'll give you an example. Close to the time when Rome collapsed, Rome was getting desperate about barbarian invasions, and they withdrew their legions from Britannia, from Great Britain. They just pulled them out. And they sent a letter, which we still have, which is an apology saying, I'm sorry, but we need those people. You're going to have, they say you have to look to your own defense now. It's a classic moment in the history of the British Isles. And nobody before or after could mistake the difference. I mean, it was completely different. So that's it on political economy. But then, as Ari was alluding to, you can see the exact same thing happening on language. Because
I'm sorry if I interject, but yeah, the Western Europe, Rome fell. But as far as the East was concerned, the Chinese, the Indians, the
Asia,
Middle
completely
East,
different.
Rome's still there until the 15th century.
We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that. But in general, the Western Roman Empire did collapse, with the barbarian invasions. But the language changed. So as Latin evolves and adapts and develops over the course of Rome's domination, but after Rome's collapse, it fragments. And Spain and France and Italy and Romania and other places, their dialects of Latin start diverging wildly. And within a few centuries, they can't understand each other and they can't understand Latin. There's been a Tower of Babel phenomenon. So even at a linguistic, literary level, there's been a massive change, a shattering of what used to be essentially a unity there because of the flow of people and the flow of commerce and the flow of literature. Another level that you can see, and along with that, by the way, is illiteracy. During the Roman Empire, they had a very high rate of people at least being able to write their names and filthy graffiti on the walls about the governor they didn't like or their neighbor who was a poo-poo head. I mean, everybody could write something, but within a century or two, the collapse of the system also meant a collapse of an educational system, and the consequence was that only a minority of people were literate within a century or two. And we'll talk about Jim's question about the church and its role. But barbarians definitely came in from outside and conquered and took over Rome and began running Rome themselves. Aside from what the church did, there's no question that non-Christian people moved in and took. They also invaded the empire. I mean, once the legions are pulled back from the frontiers of Rome, a massive wave of migrations begins. So there's huge changes in the genetics. You can see this at a biological level. And people coming from the German territories, people coming from Slavic territories, people coming from the East in Asia, people coming from the steppes, they're all pushing in to areas that used to be controlled and defended by Rome. And that didn't happen that way before the collapse. Another thing that happens is representational art. Under the Romans, it inherited the Greek model. And so they were doing hyper-realistic sculptures of people, even if they were exaggerated, right? Like Nero is given a Arnold Schwarzenegger body and they stick Nero's head on top, which is absurd. It still looks like an Arnold Schwarzenegger body, right? You know what I mean? And it's recognizably Nero's face. But within a few centuries after the collapse of Rome, people are down to doing children's drawings. I mean, when you look today at the level of art that's being produced in 600, 700, and 800, it's the kind of thing that you think, I might be able to do that myself. I mean, yeah, the artistry of the pigments, the artistry of, mosaics and all those things, that's all amazing. on the one hand, but on the other hand, compared to what they were able to do just a short time before, it's astonishing the huge drop in their capacity to realistically depict the world that's around them. So what I'm aiming at here is not that these things all happen at the same time. They really don't. But they happen within a certain period of time, each on its own timeline, so that before the period, you'd say, well, this is definitely what the classical world looks like. And by the end of the period of transition, you say, this is definitely not what the classical world looks like. We have definitely moved on to something else. And where it's confusing for people is when they're in the middle. Is it still the ancient era, or is it now the medieval era, or what is it? And the usual existentialist answer is, don't get too hung up on that. There isn't going to be a clean line. It's a period of transition. And it moves at different paces in different places. So I hope that makes sense of kind of the question that Ari's asking and the question that Sharon is asking. It is simultaneously true that you can point to a number of important dates, but there's not just one of them, and they're spread out. And the fact that they're spread out makes it more like what Sharon's talking about. There's a transition, but the transition isn't imperceptible. It's a series of shocks to the system. And eventually people are bewildered because the shocks are now coming from every angle. They think that their system will last forever. When the first shock happens, they're bewildered, but they think, well, at least we still have everything else. But then a shock hits them from another angle and another, and eventually they don't have any of the things they had in the previous epoch. And it's their descendants who can look back and go, wow, these are not the glory days anymore. In Anglo-Saxon England, there were myths. They had myths that said that all those huge Roman walls and towers, that there must have been an age of giants, and that the giants built all those things. They didn't even, some people knew enough history to know that it was the Romans, but widespread in the population, they didn't remember anymore much about Rome. And they thought, wow, to make something that big, we don't ever make anything that big. They must have been like titans or giant monsters or something. You can find it in Celtic mythology all over the place. So the age of giants. And it's because they've forgotten their own history. They don't know how they got where they are. There's been a huge rupture and discontinuity. Now, what happens at the end of the medieval period, mostly we're going to go into detail on that in about a year and a half, not now. We're mostly trying to focus on the rising stage, as Rome is collapsing and Christianity is rising, because we gotta get clear about this revolutionary thing. Go ahead, Sharon.
I just have one question, because this is something that's always fascinating me. As you go from each epoch, from one epoch to the other, and you maintain elements of the previous epoch, just as you said, what's the role of tradition there? Because it's the tradition that carries some of these basal elements from one epoch to the next. So that's why I think it's not a straight line. It's an emergence, because we maintain our traditions. If you look at the Catholic Church, the Pope, they're still holding that thing and swinging the incense. They've been doing that forever.
Yes.
What does it mean? I don't know.
Well,
it's just tradition,
The role of tradition gets interesting here, because typically what's happening is by the late stage of an epoch, it has become corrupt. The powers that be no longer believe in the fundamental values of their epoch, but they pretend to. They keep going through the motions because they have to. They can't be in charge if they don't honor the tradition outwardly. But inwardly they don't. And so you end up with greater and greater levels of corruption until it finally reaches a point where nobody can pretend anymore that the rulers are ethical. And when that happens, the movement towards revolution becomes very strong. And we know that this happens in part because the Greeks wrote about it, and the Romans write about it very clearly. I mean, what you're talking about as tradition is one of the clearest ways in which they express the sense that things are failing. So Diogenes wandering through the marketplace at Athens with a lit lantern, trying to illuminate people during broad daylight. And they're asking, what the hell are you doing? Why do you need a lantern in the day? He says, because I'm trying to search for an honest man. And then he'll hold the lantern on the speaker for a bit, peer at him, and then shake his head sadly and move on. He's trying to emphasize something, dramatize something that people all over the Greek world are seeing back in the 400s, which is the Greeks of today are not like our forefathers. They have become complacent. They don't honor the values of our tradition. We're concerned about where this is going. It can't, those are the values that made it possible for us to arise in the first place. And if we're not true to them, then everything's going to fall apart. And other people will say, you're just a, negative, you poo-poo on you, it's everything's fine. But it usually turns out that these predictions are correct, that in fact things are changing, and they're going to change a lot faster as you get closer to the declining side of the empire. It isn't that long before Athens falls, right? And is conquered by Sparta, and then Corinth and Thebes get in there, and they're fighting each other, and then eventually all the Greeks are beaten by the Macedonians, which is this issue of enormous shame to the Greeks. How could we have fallen so far that even our hillbilly cousins were able to come in here and kick our butts? The same thing happens in the Roman period. Before the end of the Roman Republic, before the rise of the empire, people are, and this is something Stephen's talked about before, like with the Gracchi brothers and others, you've got Republicans who are saying the noble Roman virtues that made it possible for us to become great are not seen anymore in people. We're seeing self-interest and corruption, and people are not living up to those values, and this isn't going to end well. Well, it takes another 500 years or so before it completely falls apart for the Romans, but they can see the decline coming because of the deviation from tradition. So tradition ends up playing this interesting role. And early, it is the complaints of the conservatives where you see tradition, where they say, I don't like these new progressives. They're trampling our traditions. This isn't going to end well. But by the end stage of an epoch, the traditions are being used in exactly the opposite way. They're saying this entire system isn't working. Nothing about it is working. Nothing's working anywhere. I'm not allowed to fix any problems. I'm just a prisoner of this great machine, and it's all got to go. And the reason it has to go is an appeal to the old tradition. This is the weird paradoxical thing, is the tradition becomes a revolutionary force during an era when the epoch is so corrupt that none of the powers that be are honoring the tradition. So we see this, as we're going to talk about this today, in the teachings of Jesus and in the rise of early Christianity. Partially what they're doing is revolutionary, and certainly it ushers in a new epoch. But partially what they're doing is an appeal to tradition. And they're saying, there are these old values that are conspicuous by their absence in the world around us, and that has to change. No matter what it takes, we have to be true to our old values. And in the course of doing that in a revolutionary movement, as we'll see, the values change. And they forget what their tradition was, and they think the new thing that they've innovated is their tradition. It's a great question, Sharon. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, so I appreciated the question as well. I think that to some degree that having some form of measurement as to when things change is it's important. However, I don't know if it lends itself to that, especially, and I like the way you had actually expressed it when you said it's a living organism, and that it kind of evolves and things emerge from that. And you can start to identify certain types of, certain principles and identify patterns, right? And then you can take an idea of the modern mindset and then break down what the modern mindset actually is and start to say, what are the attributes that actually make the modern mindset what it is? And then you can start to say, okay, well, where does this fall historically? And you can maybe get an idea as the time frame, right? But it's not going to be a hard stop. And an interesting way, kind of the reason why I think that this is so important is because a lot of times we do measure ourselves by metrics, but that the metrics are always contextual. So, a really basic example, if you look at a company and you looked at their price earnings ratio or something like that, or, something along those lines. And, in some instances, it's meaningful, like even I would even say certain periods of time during, like, we could say there was a the dot-com boom. It really didn't mean anything anymore. But prior to that, then it did. So that time period, it did. But there's no hard and fast metric that's going to give you, I think, when these changes occur. Now, I do think that you can look at certain things like values. And I think you can also look at things like corruption. And I also think the economics lend themselves to new ideas, to adopting new ideas as well. But then you have to think about, okay, what is it then? How do values change along those lines? And identifying how things change is probably a more effective way of kind of seeing when these shifts occur, rather than like looking at a hard and fast metric. There's something that was, there's, and this doesn't directly have any, relate, but there is some similarities there. There is something called the OODA loop in essentially in defense, that there was a fighter pilot that could get behind any other fighter pilot within 60 seconds. And one of the things that the framework really stresses is the idea of specifically not using metrics. And this happens with almost every organization. I was actually in a conversation about this morning, that you start managing yourself to the metric, and for the values get lost in the process. And so the organization then crumbles underneath that. So, I mean, where so there's not a hard and fast way to measure that type of progress. And within that, when you're talking about these types of changes and and I think Sharon captured it well. It's kind of an emergent property, like something emerges based off of a set of attributes and ideas. And you can also look at things like, what are the scientific advancements? What are the artistic advancements? What are some of those other things that then tend to, change society's values? And I think that will indicate something. And the idea of the modern is that you're kind of looking back and saying how the ancients knew nothing. And what you can say is essentially a lot of the scientific advancements that they felt to be so absolute, that they happen to be wrong. Within the context of we're speaking anyway. So I think that's it, but it's a great question, because like, what are these shifts? What takes, what creates these shifts? But it is something that's emergent. And in some ways, I think quantifying it, or, becoming too analytical with it, that's modern in and of itself. Right. So that's like that everything can be reduced to a number. And even, certain, in general, we've talked about that here extensively. So, but I think what Kenneth does do is give us a framework, in the sense that, even the example that we were talking about with, the idea of heaven and hell and what that did for Christianity. So you have the idea of Christianity being adopted. And why was Christianity being adopted? Because, well, there's a whole host of reasons as to why, Constantine and as well as, where Rome was at that particular moment in time. And so that then what happens from there is that, well, you have the values that are changing, and then you have this idea of heaven and hell. And these are indicators of how I think, that people become modern or ancient, or, or less, modern or postmodern, or whatever it may be, where you see these different epochs emerge. So I do think it's it's directly relevant to everything that Kenneth's doing. Is he's kind of giving us the ideas that underpin these changes.
Yeah, I think that's right. And of course, the way that he goes about it, for those who are new to the call, he doesn't go about it by saying, behold, I am the guru, Kenneth Smith, and I have a system, and you must subscribe to it and be my follower. Kenneth does it like a philosophy professor. He says, look what Hegel says about history. Look what Hannah Arendt says about history. Look what he wants to point you to all the other philosophers and writers who are working in this arena so that, it encourages the investigative cosmopolitan approach to trying to study these issues rather than a kind of fideist orthodoxy based approach. And to do that, he sketches in a framework, like in this book. He sketches in a framework that is enough to get us started and get us asking questions and digging. And it's part of what we're doing in this seminar that's different from the book, but is compatible with it is we are pairing up his writing with other contemporary writings. If he's talking about the transition from teaching Jesus's message and spirituality to turning it into a reward and punishment scheme to get people to obey, then we're talking about we're reading Thomas, we're reading Q, we're reading the Didache, we're actually looking at the documents where these transitions are happening to see that he's not just saying it, it's actually right there in the contemporary texts, the things he's pointing at.
I will say one thing is that, if I may, that also what you were just talking about, the idea of tradition and the role of tradition, that's something where you can look at technology specifically as having a huge impact on that. So the idea of something being written, writing's a technology. So, I mean, if you look at it, then that enables tradition. Right. So these are the things that you kind of look for that fundamentally change cultures and change the way people function. And that's not usually a metric. Now, you maybe can measure the velocity. I mean, in the sense that the speed of which information travels. And so the things like the printing press come to mind, and things along those lines. You look at, what is it that then creates the environment for people to, move in one direction or the other. But again, that's not going to be necessarily captured in a metric. And so that's where the contextual aspect of something will actually change what the number means. And that's what makes it hard.
Yeah, right on, Joe. I mean, this is what's tricky about answering RE and Sharon's question. You're right that the temptation is to look for simple metrics, but the moment we do that, we miss the whole picture. The metrics are only useful as clues, and we have to be careful not to put too much faith in our selection of metrics, but to try to look at the larger picture and see what evidence emerges. It's one of the ways in which my wife's a history major, and she says one of the things that scientists who study physics and chemistry don't understand about history is that despite the fact that you can't replicate it in a lab, it's still a science. But what makes it a science is not, your ability to be absolutely certain and make absolute laws of nature and say this is what it is. What makes it a science is that you go back to the evidence. You go collect more evidence. You do your best to gather more information, and you let that change your mind and change your models. And that's the scientific method in action, right? That we let the world correct our ideologies. But Sharon, you wanted to jump in and add something.
I just wanted to jump in here because Joe said something that really caught my imagination. Martin Luther and the Reformation. The Reformation was made possible because of the emergence of the printing press. So the general public now, those that were literate, were able to read. Otherwise, they were just making beautiful frescoes inside the church. They were just painting. That's how they learned their gospel. But with the emergence of the printing press, we go from one epoch to the other.
There's an explosion in literacy.
Exactly. Exactly.
And that explosion in literacy is as big a before and after as the collapse in literacy at the end of the Roman epoch. It's one of the ways, it's one of the many clues that shows us that the medieval world is coming to an end and being replaced by the modern world.
And it very much changes what the values and what people think to be, what is knowledge.
Yes.
And that's dangerous, because it can be like, well, now we know everything and everybody before us knew nothing. And that's essentially what it happens often. And that's where we abandon some of those things that I would say the ethics is something that ought to be recaptured from, the ancients. And that is one of the things that still stands the test of time. Like,
Yes.
and especially the idea of cosmopolitanism in particular. When you think about that, that was something that was, I'd say very advanced, and we moved towards something much more mechanistic.
Tradition.
Yeah. So it's anyway.
Anyway, thank you for that. That's great. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I do wish people would make their rhetoric straighter, because doomsday's at hand, people. You got to get all your propositions down for the day of the coming of whatever. But anyway, I was, so many, 20 years ago, I was looking at this question, when you see the difference between the two sides of politics in America, it was becoming, mercenary. It wasn't what we knew when we were little kids. And there was that example there that was the fall of the Roman Republic, and so you're seeing the fall of the American Republic. And it was a process that really began with Gracchi, who wanted to make Rome great again. Rome had become an empire. Supposedly it was a republic, but it has really become an empire, and the Republican form couldn't hold an empire, because you had every guy in the Senate had their own little program going, and this was screwing with the larger world, causing all sorts of problems. But after about 100 years of wannabe Caesars, you finally got one that stuck. And of course, the amazing thing, even with Julius Caesar, they were so rigidly adhering to their old forms that, this is a democracy, man. Let's assassinate this evil dude, Julius Caesar. All they got was another civil war and a whole new load of bloodletting. Now, I didn't know about Spengler really 20 years ago, but I realised that he was very much looking at these historical examples, and he was sort of pointing out that modern Western culture was starting to hit its decline phase, not fall, decline. And this sort of began, with the collapse of Western Rome was a process, let's say, from 400 AD to 500 AD. The Huns came and went. The world had, for the Western Rome had drastically changed from what it was in 400 AD. You would have looked around, everything looks fine. 500 AD, a lot of stuff is in the dust. Now, Spengler was saying the new culture was probably the Frankish Empire. The Franks rose. They were a group of barbarians that tried to rise above themselves. So the basis of modern Western culture was that sort of that Frankish Empire. And he was saying, well, what we call the Dark Ages was the budding phase. Everyone would have looked at Western Europe in the Dark Ages and thought, what a bad show. The flowering was the high Middle Ages, and people said, oh yeah, looks a little cute, looks a little nice. They're out of the mud a bit. But if you had shown anyone the world in 1000 AD and you looked around the English Channel and the angel, looking down the earth, the angel said that this culture, 500 years from now, will start dominating the world. You got to be joking. This makes no sense. You know, you look at China or the Arab world or India and you think they're way ahead. These are hillbillies. These are backward people. But of course, you know, in the 16th century, you know, the Chinese emperor's officials would be looking out at the port cities, you know, these lines of European gunships, which they had no proper answer for. Going, what the hell? I read that these barbarians, everybody's told us they're just a collection of Beverly hillbillies. They're idiots. And now suddenly our harbours are full of them and we can't stop them. It came out of nowhere, but of course, you know, Goethe would say if you looked at the budding and the flowering, you would have seen something coming along. And of course, he talked about the fruiting stage. Well, in ancient times, the fruiting stage, you know, was what we thought of as the noble Greek epochs. Plato, Aristotle, you know, they'd risen out of the mud. 500 AD, they're producing refined statues. They're producing a whole lot of new ideas. And then the day of the dictator arose in the 2nd century. Now, we taught to look upon Rome, the magnificence, in that whole 500-year period. That's it. Look at all the Colosseum. Look, it's beautiful. But Spengler was saying, well, really, it was static. It's building some nice buildings, but you know, what was going on with the philosophy? Not much. New ideas. Oh, if you showed up with a new idea, what happened to you? The emperor would say, well, there's the love hand and there's a hate hand. The hate hand puts you in the arena. But I suggest you go for the love land. I'm sending you off to the barbarians on the border. That's what they did with philosophers. And you think being a philosopher was a safe occupation. No longer. You're in a new world. But anyway, that's my central points. With metaphysics, watch out using that word essential. It might work with physics, but with metaphysics, you're really risking things when you think you've got the essentials. So those are my 3 points. The rhetoric, work on it, get your ideas down pat, don't wander too much because the end of the world is soon. You know, the Spengler's definition of the ages, I find quite interesting. And watch out for that word essential in metaphysics. Thank you. Sorry I took so long.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm going to call on Ari in a second, but there's actually a little bit of the intro I didn't do yet. First of all, I just, for those new to the call, I note that for every one of these seminars, almost all of them, certainly last time and this time, David Royal writes a little capsule summary of kind of where we are in the chapter and what Ken is talking about. So I'm gonna read that to us, and then I'm gonna talk about one more thing, and then I'll call on Ari. So David wrote, rather than elevating spiritual selflessness, Christianity, and by here he's using the term the way that Kenneth's using. He's not talking about Christianity today. He's talking about medieval Christianity. Medieval Christianity spread by appealing to the lowest human motives, fear of punishment and desire for reward, turning heaven and hell into tools of spiritual self-interest rather than principles of intrinsic value. This corruption reduces faith to a transactional system that caters to the most hedonistic and unreflective attitudes, betraying the essence of spiritual life. So that's kind of some of the themes that Ken is talking about in the sentences that where we left off last week and where we're going to be picking up for the final hour this week. Before we do that, we're gonna resume doing the other half of what we do on these medieval seminars, which is side by side with Kenneth's stuff, which is where we finish. we start by going through some of the source material. And last time we talked about Q, the Q source, which the piece of the imagined piece of writing that Matthew and Luke had in common that they were looking at in addition to looking at Mark. Clearly both of them are influenced by Mark, but throughout the late 19th and throughout the 20th century, the main hypothesis about where Matthew and Luke disagree with Mark and agree with each other has to do with this idea that they weren't just looking at one source, Mark, which was written before the two of them, but that they were also looking at a second source, which is a collection of wisdom sayings mainly. And the Germans named that source Q after the German word Quelle. And through the course of 140 years of scholarship, they were able to sort of tease out what are the parts in common between Matthew and Luke that didn't come from Mark and that therefore must have come from Q. So we've been going through that, especially for those interested in reading on their own. We're sort of informed by Burton Mack's book, The Lost Gospel, the Book of Q and Christian Origins. And I put a link up there to the website where you can read Burton Mack's translation of the Q text, but the actual book itself is well worth picking up. I just finished reading it this morning, and we're going to talk probably this week and next week. We're going to talk about some of that material where he talks about the early Christian church and how it changed over the first 100, 200, 300 years. What were the different concerns? At what stage did each new concern arise? Why did it arise? And how did they change, the teachings of Jesus to take into account the new conditions? So we're going to talk about all that and get back into the Kenneth Smith armed with that. But first, Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, everybody. I wanted to, I guess, at least maybe put a soft landing on things we were talking about before with, when to know things have changed. Is it a specific point or a slow, gradual thing over time? And I think, of course, we're saying the answer is yes, but I think it's marked by both. Like I'm thinking the way the Grand Canyon, that's a silly example. I like the idea of World War I, that you can look at different things. Something like there's a person that most of us probably don't know, but his name is Emilio Princeps, and he was the one who assassinated the Archduke Ferdinand. That is argued to say that one event is what started all of World War I. And so from this very like mechanistic, what I'm going to use a language that we talk about in some of other groups, but I don't think we do so much here, but it's a common way of looking at two things, is the manifest view versus the scientific view. Essentially, there's the mechanistic view and there's the emergent view, is what I'm labeling these things as. And I think we're all making the point here that they're both very important. And I was thinking just like in biology, medicine, that like, not to say that I know Sharon's job, but I'm going to imagine that someone's under, using, tools to remove their consciousness, that you use physical chemical markers to then get certain metrics. But at the same time, if the person wakes up, it doesn't matter what system, you can see from this manifest, from this urgent point of view, oh crap, right? Status quo is now changed. So same for one, yeah, in the beginning when Emilio Princeps, you see like mechanistically caused this whole thing to become in motion. But I was thinking if you're like an alien watching from outer space, it's like when the first German massive column to Belgium and starts all the mess in Belgium and the whole war starts, like, oh, that's when I'd point to from an emergent point of view, when things look like they actually changed. At the same time, there's all these behind the scenes smuggled in roots that are growing, smuggled in baggage that have seeds that have been planted and grown and then finally flowered here. That I like the idea that you have two different ways. And I think this is really said nicely by, I'm going to see if I can add on to him, or he can just totally reject what I'm about to say. But I think it's like this. When he's saying with metaphysics, you need to be careful with essentialism, but in physical systems you don't, is that essentially smuggled in that word, in the person being under anesthetized situation, tricks to see how much is the tonic level of any figure of whatever chemical we need in their system, right? Those metrics we can be essential about. We look at these specific chemicals and these specific rates, these specific time frames, done. But then the manifest view, he's talking about the essential. Be careful not to do that with the person, actually being awake. Because what if, you're seeing no properties, like they're not talking, but all of a sudden their eyes are open and they're looking around? Was that on one of your metric lists? If it wasn't, then you've missed the boat. right? So when it comes to emergent properties, you follow the rule of unintended consequences, which is you look for big changes, but you literally can't define them. But in terms of the underlying things that cause the big changes, you can look for those. And then you're like, oh, based on this thing that I saw, I should look for, like you said, clues. I should look for a real crime that has been done. But I can't say based on the clues exactly which crime is happening. And right, that only tells me that there is a crime or there should be a crime, but maybe I haven't been able to see it yet. Right. And so this is where it's really interesting if we look at what's happening now. Also, I think one of those metrics is argued by many, but my favorite is Rabbi Sachs argues that the primary driver of all of this is technological information systems change. Information processing is changing, therefore energy throughput is changing, and therefore you have some emergent level property that is going to be different. But just like I think boiling, at the temperature right now, if you put your water on, tiny little bubbles are being made in the surface tension. So there is a form of boiling going on. But we only think it really matters at that 100 degrees Celsius mark when we see the emergence of big bubbles and steam, right? So like, who said that's boiling versus not? There is an emergence that we're looking for. We're looking for emergent properties that are almost just, I hate to use the silly metaphor here, but it's like pornography. I can only identify it. I can only know it when I've seen it, as opposed to I can describe it ahead of time. There's something emergent about it that's necessary, which gives a really fascinating bigger question, like not being able, you can recognize you predicting the unpredictable. Like I recognize I cannot predict certain things, which then alters my perception, which will then have me looking for certain things that I wouldn't have been able to perceive otherwise. So it's a really strange paradox of perception, this measurement problem, just like in physics, seeing for something being a particle or a wave. I feel like that's happening here. So anyways, I'll finish, but it's just interesting to point out that the particle wave idea is that, yes, there are major events that happen, and then there's essentials, mechanisms to look for those underneath. But I think you can only do the real mechanisms when you're looking at like this scientific view that's very routine and always predictable in terms of objective realities versus the subjective thing, which is like in chaos systems where things are doing things on their own and essentially they're alive and you can't pin it down. And I was thinking about this final idea that the idea is that living things are essentially characterized by being non-local, both in time and in space. And they're doing things in space and time on purpose, essentially. They're trying to manage entropy and stuff. Well, the point is to point out a specific time for an event is faulty because this whole living organism is spread over multiple times. And similarly, to say it's happening here and now, or just here, because no, all the things happened before that caused this to exist elsewhere. So it's both in time and space, things are non-local. And so it's really tricky to go between the manifest and the scientific view. But you can use one to sort of signal the other. And I think that's what we want to look for in terms of our own approach to Kenneth. He's going to tell us the things to look for, and then we're going to try and discuss, or he's going to show us, and we're trying to discuss the emergent properties. I almost feel like as a philosopher, he's saying, hey, here's all these things. What do you think about it? Right? He's not telling us to believe this is this and this is this. He's like, here's all these interesting metrics that I'm going to point out that you're probably not looking at. What does that mean? What are the emergent things that are happening? Like he's getting us to look in our own lives and look this way. Anyway, so yeah, it's a good place.
Thank you, Ari. Appreciate it. Sharon,
I have a question about cultures changing, epochs changing, and using a quantitative measure to put on it. I just don't know if we can do that. I think it's more qualitative. And if we can do it quantitatively, then you need to tell me why. Because as the epochs emerges, there tends to be chaos. And what keeps you grounded in that chaos is the traditions. That's what I ruminate on. And one of my favorite songs of tradition is Teve, the milkman, in Fiddler on the Roof. The opening song is tradition. And he says he goes to Hebrew school, then they find him a wife, then he gets married, then he has children. And in all this chaos, those are those critical elements which govern his life.
I love that play.
Yes.
It's so good.
That's what that's in fact, it was that play that made me start really to look at the role of tradition in our lives. You know, it's very critical, but the culture and the chaos and the epoch still emerges qualitatively. And I don't know if you could put a metric on it. And if you can, then tell me how to, because I don't understand.
Well, I mean, I'm going to
I was going
use,
to say real fast, Rick. That's my kind of my whole spiel, real succinctly, was you can use certain things, metrics, to show you that there's things you should look for. But essentially, the whole point is that the really important stuff you can't measure directly. You have to look for the qualitative stuff. But the quantitative stuff signal that there should be qualitative stuff going on, right?
yeah,
That's the key. And
yes,
but I was trying to make that exact point that you're saying, Sharon, that you can't you'll make the mistake when you're trying to do the essential stuff that Stephen is also learning about. That you're moving frameworks and you're not realizing that then the rules are going to change. And
yeah,
we're also making our own rules here that like essentially, yeah, that you can't do that.
yeah, that's right. You know, it's the process of science is largely about letting the world in. And that partially means going out to gather more information than you thought you needed and looking in places you didn't think you would have to look. And you're looking for clues that you're missing part of the picture. That's what you're looking for, right? And this is what a doctor does with the tests. They're looking for clues that point to something. And you know, if you find that a patient's temperature is such and such and their white blood count is so and so and their blood pressure is thus and thus, you know, it doesn't give you a fixed, you know, answer, but it points you in directions. It makes you, it gives you ways to start to focus on different qualitative explanations that might be at work. What could be causing this? So I think this is where Ari and Sharon are aligned, is this idea that the metrics are really only there to clue us in that something must not be the way that we thought it was. Something must be off, and now we have to go search for it. So with that in mind, you know, that's sort of we've spent, I guess, an hour and 17 minutes on the intro today, which is fine. From time to time, we have to recapitulate. But why don't we dive into the material? Our material for today, as usual, we begin with Q, and then we're going to go into the Kenneth Smith text that's next up for this week. So with Q, let me drop it in here. What we did, this link takes you to Burton Mack's translation. The translation consists of three components, and the three components represent three different historical layers of Q. Now, Q was discovered inside Matthew and Luke. It was discovered by comparing Matthew and Luke to Mark and saying the things they have in common that come from Mark, okay, that's not Q, that's Mark. And then looking at the things in Matthew and Luke that are different, where they say, okay, that's not Q either. That's just Matthew's concerns or Luke's concerns. But the things that they have in common, they say that stuff must have come from this source, Q, the Quellas, Q. And that therefore tells us some of what the writing must have been in Q. And what Burton Mack is pointing out, he starts his book with an introduction walking through the history of the scholarship on this area. It's really interesting. It's 150 years of biblical scholarship summarized in just a chapter. So anyone who doesn't want to read, you know, dozens and dozens and dozens of books from the 19th century in the original German up through the 20th century to the present, you can just read that chapter and he's summarizing and pointing you to all those people. It's very helpful. But then he says, you know, where the consensus was, and he's writing, I guess, in the late 80s, early 90s. Says where the consensus is at that time is that Q itself, now that they found it, it still doesn't represent a single set of ideas from a single population at a single moment in time. It's not that somebody sat down and from scratch wrote the document that we would have today if we reconstructed Q. He says instead, it clearly shows evidence of three different eras in the history of early Christianity, because there's three radically different modes of writing that have almost a different value system or different concerns. And scholars were in some agreement in the late 80s and early 90s about what these layers were. So if you look at the link, if you follow the link, you will see that some of the text in it is in bold, not counting the headers, just the text matter. That bold matter we went through last week, or I guess it was last time we met, which was the week before last. And the bold matter almost entirely just consists of sayings. Now, before we got into Q, we went through the Gospel of Thomas and we found the same thing. The Gospel of Thomas is not a gospel like the four canonical Gospels. It's just a sayings document. It's one of those traditional wisdom literature documents, like the sayings of the seven sages that were erected at Delphi and around the Hellenic Empire, or like the fragments of Heraclitus, or the sayings of Confucius, or Lao Tzu's sayings. They don't have a narrative. They're not telling a story. They don't talk about Jesus's betrayal and crucifixion. They don't talk about his death. They don't talk about his resurrection. They don't talk about salvation of the soul. They don't talk about the end times. They don't talk about any of that stuff. The oldest layer, which they call Q1, is really just stuff like, be nice to each other. And if people aren't listening to you in a town, then move on, it's stuff about how to be a wandering philosopher, who's challenging the status quo and trying to get people to think about their lives and think about right and wrong. And now I'm going to quote Sharon, traditional values. What is it that we're supposed to be doing in life, and are we actually doing those things? It's in the tradition of Diogenes the cynic, who was, this is cynic not like cynicism, but cynic like named after a dog. The people who said people are very confused, but dogs seem to understand life better. So let's try to figure out what the basics are of life. Early in that book, Burton Mack takes us through a chapter, which is a fantastic chapter about Galilee, where Jesus comes from, and says, modern people have all kinds of misconceptions about Galilee. It's not part of Israel. There isn't an Israel per se at this time. There are a number of different kingdoms, different areas. South of Galilee is Samaria, and we know a fair amount about Samaria because the Samaritans are still around, and there's much discussion of them. South of Samaria, and by the way, Samaria is totally different from Galilee, and we'll talk about why in a moment. South of Samaria is Judea, and Judea is the closest to what these days we would call Israel. It's the Jewish people who were captured, defeated by the Babylonians, taken away on the Babylonian exile, and they've returned, and they've built their second temple, and they've got their whole way of life built around the temple religion. South of Judea is Idumea, which again is different from Judea. Meanwhile, northwest of Galilee, on the coast, is Phoenicia, and there's a bunch of huge trading cities. They're incredibly cosmopolitan centers, and they're the endpoints of the Silk Road. Everything that's traveling all the way from China and Japan and Persia, it's passing through to these port cities on Phoenicia, and from there being distributed all over the Mediterranean, to the Greeks, to the Romans, and so forth. It's a huge international center. Next to Phoenicia is Syria, which is a major center of learning, and east of Galilee, further inland, is what's called the Decapolis, the 10 cities, and these 10 cities were founded by Alexander the Great and his people. So these are places that are very much. Hi Geneva, good to see you. We're recapitulating last time. The 10 cities of the Decapolis are classical Greco-Roman cities. I mean, they've got theaters, amphitheaters, they've got libraries, they've got marketplaces. They are centers of Greco-Roman learning. And you've got that going on in the east of Galilee, you've got that going on in the west of Galilee. There's some of that in Syria. All this places was part of Alexander the Great's empire, and the follow-on places. This is not some kind of weird rural Jewish backwater where they have not been touched by Greece or Rome. This is a place that has been part of the Hellenic world for many centuries, and is still an intrinsic cosmopolitan crossroads that's part of the Hellenic world. Even when the Romans aren't owning this area yet, it doesn't matter. They're all still wildly Hellenized. And many of the people here don't speak Jewish at all. They might recognize it and hear it they might know a few phrases. They recognize it, in discussions with rabbis, or hear it at the temple. But at home, they're speaking a variety of languages, including Greek, and some of them Latin. Now, Galilee specifically, even more than the other places, it's a melting pot. It's a mixed It's a place that has mixed populations, like Jordan is today. I guess not a lot of people don't know that about Jordan. Jordan has people from everywhere. It's you've got Iraqis, you've got Iranians, you've got Palestinians, you've got Jews, you've got Arabs, you have Circassians from the Caucasus Mountains. There's all kinds of people in Jordan, and they're all their ideas are swirling around together, like happens in the United States, where we're all being exposed to different religions and different cultures. That's Galilee. Galilee doesn't have a single major city, but they have a large number of towns, a large number of crossroads, and these roads are being frequented by traders coming from the Silk Road through the Decapolis, across Galilee, and over to the Phoenician port cities where things are being shipped all over the Mediterranean. So Galilee is not like we thought it was, right? This is a highly Hellenized place, and Galilee doesn't even have a major temple. It's the kinds of things that we think about are this. You have to think about this as a in some sense backwater, but in another sense not backwater. It's a swirling maelstrom of cultures, and it has been for a long time. And they're not zealots, because every new guy who comes along tries to get them all patriotic and excited about being conquered by the latest empire. And they're like, Jesus Christ, we've been conquered by 14 different empires at this point, and each one of them goes away. So you're not going to be able to get us excited about it. Josephus writes in his documents about his early life and his time in Palestine. He tried to get the Galileans to get all excited and join a big uprising, out of patriotism, and they're like, nah. He says, I think there's something wrong with those people. They don't have a patriotic bone in their bodies. This is Jesus's home. This is the environment in which he grows up. And so we're maybe not as surprised when we discover that the earliest layer of Q, the bold stuff in that link that I shared, doesn't consist of I am the way and the light, and no one can approach the Father but through me. There is none of that. There's none of the death or resurrection. There's no Mary. There's no infancy in Bethlehem. None of that's there. The kerygma of Paul is missing. None of that stuff is present. Instead, you have, be kind to the meek, and judge not lest you be judged. And, all of the wisdom sayings are present, but nothing else. That's as far as we got last week. And you can revisit that yourself by looking at the bold content. The second content that's in Burton Mack's translation at that link is the material that is neither bold nor italic. Neither bold nor italic is the layer they call Q2. And Q2 clearly represents a shift in interests among the Q community. Whoever these early Christians were, or I think he prefers whoever this early, Jesus movement was. They started out by being focused on the wisdom literature, and then at some point they shifted into being concerned about authority, that they needed to be taken seriously. And they were having a lot of arguments with the Jewish establishment, the Pharisees and others, and they were pushing back, and they were trying to get people to listen to what Jesus had to say, and to not discount him out of hand. And so they start trying to add more, reasons to take him as an authority. And that's the Q2 layer, the stuff that's neither bold nor italic. I'm going to save Q3 for next week. But Q2, if we just to sample a touch to see what I'm talking about here, there is a new opening added, right? I mean, the first thing that was in Q1, they're anticipating was probably something. There's a scholarly conjecture that it would have opened with the sentence, "These are the teachings of Jesus," because the very first thing that happens in Q1 is, seeing the crowds, he said to his disciples, "How fortunate are the poor, they have God's kingdom. How fortunate the hungry, they will be fed. How fortunate are those who are crying, they will laugh." Right? We're right into something that is recognizably related to the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain. It's different a bit, but it's still clearly it's that kind of beatitude stuff. And turn your cheek is there, and it's easy to love your friends, but you should also love your enemies, and all of that stuff. That's that bold stuff. That was the old layer. But after some kind of period of difficulty, whether it was 5 years or 10 years, they've revised the documents, and they've added new material structurally around those wisdom sayings. The wisdom sayings that were in Q1 are now broken up into certain groups, and there's all this connective tissue that is about, Jesus as an important teacher, and you should really listen to him. So I'm just going to go through some of the openings. After the part that would have said these are the teachings of Jesus, the scholars also conjecture that there was another sentence added that said John appeared in the countryside along the Jordan River, and now we get to the stuff that is, the Q1 layer, that is the opening of the document. Sorry, the Q2 layer, the opening of the document as we have it now. He said to the people who were coming to be plunged, i.e., in the river, which scholars think there must have been a reference. You offspring of vipers, who warned you to flee from the coming fury? Change your ways if you have changed your mind. Don't say we have Abraham as our father. I'm telling you, God can raise up children for Abraham from these stones. Even now, the axe is aimed at the root of the trees. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Now, there's other stuff that follows, but you see the change in tone from Blessed are the meek. This is angrier Jesus, or it's John. This part is John. Later we're gonna have Jesus show up as well. But this is a more forceful statement, and it is a more narrative statement than what was in the Q1 layer. And what Burt and Mack's hypothesis is that what happened is that the Q1 people, who were this mixed group of Jews and Greeks and Romans and Assyrians and people from all over the place, were just trying to form these communities and eat food together and be nice to each other and go out into the marketplace and challenge people to think about their lives, that they got enormous pushback, a growing amount of pushback from the temple and from Judea and the Samaritans, and that they're getting angry about the way that they're being treated, the way that they're being dismissed as irrelevant. And they're starting to, in a way that they hadn't done initially, they're starting to read more of the Jewish scripture and try to look for ways to argue back against the Pharisees and say, no, really, you have to take us seriously. You start to get, kind of this prophetic discussion. I'm going to jump ahead another bit. Where he said, the part that I read, the Beatitudes, how fortunate are the poor. This is QS8. Right after that, there's a Q2 layer inserted that says, how fortunate you are when they reproach you as good for nothings because of the Son of Man. Rejoice, be glad. You have a great reward in heaven. That is exactly how they treated the prophets. And this is new. This wasn't in the Q1 layer. But this is something that you would expect to arise when you've been getting pushback. They're saying it's okay that people are saying terrible things about you, because that's only to be expected. Stick with your message. Keep challenging the status quo. Keep sharing the wisdom literature, and don't be disheartened when you get shoved back. It's part of what it takes. Your reward will come eventually. And then there's a big stretch of Q1 material that's unbroken by Q2. And then we get down to the section that says what John and Jesus thought about each other. This is the last bit I'm going to do for today as far as quoting. The rest is there for you guys to follow up at your leisure. Where there's now a stretch of Q2 material before the section that we call instructions for the Jesus movement. And this Q2 material is biographical. And it wasn't there before. It wasn't present in the oldest layer. He says, after Jesus said these things, he went up into Capernaum, and a centurion, when he heard about Jesus, came to him begging him, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, about to die. Jesus said to him, I will come to heal him. The centurion answered him, Sir, I am not worthy to have you enter my home. Just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I am a man under orders, with soldiers under me. I say to one, go, and he goes, to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed, and said to those who were following him, I tell you, I have not found such confidence in Israel. And he said to the centurion, go. And when the centurion returned home, he found the servant well. I'm going to do the next paragraph in a moment, but first, one of the points that Burt and Mack makes about this is, notice that this is a dig against the Judea and the temple culture. He's saying, this guy is a Roman. You don't get less Jewish than a Roman centurion. But this guy pays more attention to my teaching than the temple followers in Judea. I've not found such confidence in Israel. It's a dig at the people who've been persecuting or at least disagreeing with and arguing with the original Q community. And they're adding things to push back and to start to be jabby at them and say, why don't you take us seriously? You kind of suck a little bit. If you were honest and open, you would take Jesus' saying seriously. But since you're not, you kind of are not so good. Notice that it doesn't say that Jesus went and healed the servant. Burton Mack makes a big point out of this. He says in the later Gospels, you see Jesus actually heal people. He does it himself, and the Gospels make no bones about the fact that Jesus did this thing. I mean, he didn't raise Lazarus from the dead. I mean, Jesus is actually physically conducting miracles. But this quotation from Q, if we've read the Gospels, we assume that we're reading about a miracle. But if you actually read the wording of it, it never says that Jesus healed the servant. All it says is that when the centurion returned home, he found the servant well. Servant might have recovered on his own. The point of the story is not a miracle. There might have been a miracle. There might not have been a miracle. Whoever's writing this Q2 stuff doesn't care whether there's a miracle or not. He cares about the confidence. Look at all that text that's been written about how important it is that the centurion is listening to the sayings of Jesus. He's actually listening the way you're supposed to listen to the great teacher. That's what Q2 is worried about. It's really different from Paul. It's really different from Mark and Matthew and Luke, and certainly different from John, because the focus in any of those would have been different. Here, the focus is, please listen to this guy. This guy's important. The next, and this is the last bit I'll do, it falls right after it, QS 16. John heard about this and sent his disciples to ask, are you the one to come, or should we look for another? Right. Notice that Jesus is not actually meeting with John. That isn't in Q. That gets added later. Jesus is just meeting with one of John's disciples. And what Jesus says to John's disciple is, go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind recovered their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor are given good news. And fortunate is, this is the critical part. And fortunate is the one who is not disturbed at hearing these things about me. Again, the focus is, okay, miracles, maybe, who cares? The important thing is, can you pay attention to what I'm trying to tell you? Can you acknowledge that I'm an authority who has things to say that you need to listen to? If there are miracles, they only exist in order to reinforce the message. And so, after a few more paragraphs of this, Q goes right back to the original Q1 layer text of, we're going to talk about the foxes have dens and the birds of the sky have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. We're back to the wisdom literature, the sayings. The sayings make up the meat, even at Q2. But the Q2 stuff is framing it into chunks, in each case to add a little bit of biography and a little bit of, especially a focus on, you really need to listen to this guy. What this guy has to say is important. And by the time we finish Q2, what we don't have is we don't have anything that Paul writes about. I mean, there is no salvation. There's no cross. There's no death and resurrection. None of that. It's not there. We don't have how to build a church. I mean, there's some simple stuff here about, if you've got a house church and they're offering you food, you shouldn't scoff at it and you should mind your manners. And that's about it. This is clearly from a stage of development where it's house churches and wandering philosophers, and they're tired of being pushed around, but they're still trying to hold together as a community. None of the rest of the stuff is there yet. And certainly the things we see from the Gospels that have all these rich biographies of he went here and he did this, and here's Mary and here's Lazarus, and here's there's no mention of the apostles, the disciples. They're not here even at the Q2 layer. They certainly weren't there at the sayings layer. And as we saw in Thomas, the only apostle mentioned anywhere in Thomas was James. The rest of them are completely absent. So the point that Burton Mack is making, and that I want to emphasize here, is that we have an early stage right after Jesus has passed. We have an early stage of Christianity in which many of the things that we associate with being the centerpieces of Christianity don't exist in the Jesus community yet. What we have in the Jesus community is people who really think he's a great teacher, and they want to maintain his literature. They want to maintain his sayings, and they want to do their best to live according to his teachings. And as time goes on, maybe 5 to 10 years, they get pushback from the dominant establishment. And when that pushback happens, they start to take a greater interest in the Pharisees and why the Pharisees might be wrong. And they start to take a greater interest in the Jewish literature. And they look for places in the Jewish literature that might suggest that Jesus is right and the Pharisees are wrong. It's being introduced for rhetorical purposes to try to get people to listen to the Beatitudes, basically. It's like, I know you want to, when I tell you to take care of the poor, I know you want to ignore me, but this is really why you should listen to what Jesus has to say about taking care of the poor. And Stephen was alluding earlier to the apocalyptic stage of Christianity. It's not present in Q1, it's not present in Thomas, and it's not present in Q10, Q2. It's coming. Don't worry. Stephen's right. It's coming, and it's coming in the first century. It's early, but it's not this early. It gets added later. There's no evidence here that he's an apocalyptic preacher. He's getting cranky a little bit, but he's still really focused on, be good. For the love of God, be good. Be decent human beings. Treat each other well. It's actually strikingly close to, if you've seen Monty Python and the Life of Brian, the thing that they suggest, it's a comedy. Many people find it blasphemous, but other people find it spiritual because it pokes fun at the religion that grew up around Jesus while honoring Jesus himself. I mean, the opening scene is Jesus preaching to the people, and it's the Beatitudes, and he's saying, be decent to each other, be good human beings, be willing to take a punch if that's what it takes to, be willing to be hurt if that's what it takes to help each other. You gotta go out into the world and be good. And we see that this Q1 layer and Thomas are weirdly close to that, Life of Brian version of Jesus. We're not going to stop here. I'm not trying to say this is all there is to the picture, but each week we're going to add a layer. Next week we'll talk about Q3 and the rest. One of the points that Burton makes about what we see in Q1 and Q2 that's important, and I just read this morning when I finished his book. He says, why sayings? I mean, why wouldn't they have written down Jesus's biography? Why wouldn't they have told you where he went, what he did? Why did they just put sayings together? And Mac makes the point that this is how, I don't know what the right term is. There were movements all over the Hellenistic world of people who were dissatisfied with the status quo, and we're trying to, going back to what Sharon was saying, we're trying to put together tradition again to say, well, how should we live? How do I decide what's right and wrong? How should I treat my fellow members of this community that are trying to, come together? And Burton Mack makes the point that one of the things that we don't teach people about the Hellenic world is the extent to which they used these collections of sayings as two different things. One of them it was a basis for ethical behavior. They were, he said, they were used, and I heard this elsewhere before too. The sayings, as much as they were studied by philosophers or literary critics or what have you, the place you heard them the most was at home or in the community. People would memorize collections of sayings or groups of sayings that appealed to them, that they thought were moral, and then they would just pop out with them at key moments in their life. Something would happen and they go, oh yeah, blessed are the meek, or oh yeah, shake the dust of the sandals of that town off your sandals. And we do the same thing today. All of us do. We have these little fragments of wisdom we carry around with us, and they occur to us. You hear me say gnothi se auton. You hear me say ethos anthropoi daimon. You hear me say, phusis cryptis thai philai. I collect these things and I have them, and you have your collections of sayings that you use throughout your life. And if your children or other relatives or neighbors are confused about a problem and you see that one of your wisdom fragments applies, you bring it out and you talk about it with them. You say, yeah, I know, it's real, times like this are really hard, but remember, and then you'll say the thing. right? And so what Max says, and I've heard before, is that that used to be an organized tradition. Now it's just something we do. It's Kenneth Smith would say it's a fragment of ancient culture that is still that has survived for thousands of years, and it's a habit that hasn't been erased. It wasn't erased by medieval culture, and it hasn't been erased yet by modern culture. We all still do it because we find comfort in it. But it used to be the way that these things were taught, right? It used to be. Um, I'll come back to Stephen's comment in a moment. It used to be how ethics were taught. And people would read these sayings and then try to figure out a way of life. But there's a second thing, and this is, I think, the even more important thing that Burton Mack talks about these sayings. And this is going to take us back to the ancient world and its worldview, and it's going to give us a bridge between the classical world and the medieval world, right on this issue. And it goes like this: how did the Greeks and Romans teach rhetoric? How did they teach composition? How did they teach you to be a great writer or a great orator? Well, they did it on the basis of the ancient idea of ethos, ethos anthropoi daimon. Each historical figure who's worthy of remembering has a character, and that character teaches us things about the human condition and how we ought to live. And knowing the character is more important than knowing the details of their life, right? You want to get to the heart of what Socrates is like as a person. If you're in a classical education in the ancient world, you want to get to where you can recite a number of Socrates' sayings. And what they would teach you when they were teaching you to write or compose is they'd set you an assignment. They'd say, imagine that Socrates is in Galilee, and fishermen have just hauled in a big haul of fish.
I didn't even notice it. My computer was in the way.
Sorry, Jim. You came off mute there. Oh, I think that was an accident. I'm going to go ahead and mute him again. They'd say, imagine this scenario, put Socrates in it. Now tell me what Socrates would say. Write me a dialogue of Socrates in his character. Show me, that you understand what his character is, his ethos, and compose something new. It's somewhere between fanfic and a literature exercise. So today, if you go into English classes, they're going to assign you things like, write me 3 pages on what you did this weekend, or, write me, the Beverly's in graduate school, and she gets these things like, read this book and then write me a condensation of what this guy had, the most important points this guy had to say and what they mean in your life. This is a typical way that we teach people to write and think about materials like this. And Burton Mack says that's how they used to teach writing and oratory in the old world. Say, imagine that that you're Aristotle, and Aristotle, Alexander the Great has just finished the battle of such and such, and now Aristotle is going to lecture him about something he did wrong. What would Aristotle say? And you have to write it so convincingly that anybody reading it could say, yeah, that totally sounds like Aristotle. That is the ethos of Aristotle. You have captured him there. For all intents and purposes, Aristotle, for these exercises and for the way that history was taught, Aristotle's not a biographical a person who appeared at a period in history and did certain things and didn't do other things. Aristotle is a character who has a certain persona, a value system, a way of seeing the world, and anybody can add to Aristotle's story if they understand Aristotle and who he really was, his ethos. As evidence of that, he cites Diogenes Laertius's Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, in which Diogenes Laertius starts with the 7 sages and goes all the way up to his own time, which is centuries of we would call it history or biography. And he covers all these different philosophers, Thales and Chilon of Bios and Heraclitus and the rest. And in each section on each philosopher, he includes some of their main aphorisms or sayings, just like we see in Q1, and a few biographical facts and things that people have said about them. And then he tells little stories including things that today everybody's pretty sure he made up. So, for example, Heraclitus is the philosopher who says that all things flow. And Diogenes Laertius claims that the way that Heraclitus dies is from dropsy. And the ancients believed that dropsy is a condition in which the fluids in your body stop flowing. Now, what are the odds that that's how Heraclitus actually died? I mean, it has a literary pleasingness, especially to people who might resent Heraclitus' statement, but it doesn't actually make sense. Thales, who's always talking about looking at the heavens, doesn't see where he's going and falls in a ditch and dies. And that's what he gets for looking at the heavens and not looking at Earth. It is an ironic death, but it's almost certainly not actually how he died. Diogenes Laertius is full of this stuff. There's all this material in there that's being added to advance the story of these philosophers, some of whom we know nothing about. Some of the seven sages, we know almost nothing about them. But Diogenes Laertius, that doesn't stop him. He'll still give you pages of material on these guys that he doesn't know anything about. And he's making it up. But he's making it up like fanfic, like serious fanfic, like a literature assignment or a theology assignment. He's like, I need you to understand, based on the fragments that we have, understand the character of this writer so well that you can add to it. What was the occasion when Heraclitus might have said, character is fate? Go ahead and add a biographical detail. Say that Heraclitus was, in the marketplace one day and he saw this thing happen, and they argued with him, and it comes out, and Heraclitus ends up saying character is fate, and everyone goes, oh yeah, that's wise. That would be a typical assignment of the period when they were trying to teach you to write, teach you how to be a rhetorician. And the way we know, you don't have to trust Burt and Mac, the way we know is that material's a lot of it's still around today. A large amount of what survived from the classical world was stuff that was used as educational material in the Middle Ages or during the Renaissance. And so we have all these student essays that survive from the ancient period. And they're exactly what Burt and Mac's talking about. So first of all, that would explain why the Q1 material would be the thing that people would want to hang on to. Why just the sayings? Why not the biography? One of the things Kenneth Smith says about the ancients and how they're different, how they're not historians, he says typically they don't tell you when someone's born or when they die. They're writing all these collections, these catalogs of, here are all these great thinkers who are incredibly important to us. This is the guy who taught us about courage. This is the guy who taught us about wisdom. Here's Socrates who died for philosophy. And then they won't tell you when they were born. And from a modern perspective, you're like, why? It would have taken you, just a handful of characters. Why couldn't you be bothered? And the reason is they didn't care. Kenneth says, what they will always tell you, and you often see it in abbreviated FL, is fluorit, the Latin for flourished. When did they flourish? When were they at the peak of their powers? When were they in the most command of their core philosophies and their arete? When their character is most revealed and when they made the biggest difference in the world? That's the date that the Greeks and the Romans are giving you. And they could care less when they were born or when they died. The biography of the person didn't matter. They want to strike to that. And now we're gonna go back to Stephen. They're gonna strike to the essence of the person. They want to know what their character was and why do they matter. Because the rest of it, they figure you can just make it up on your own. You could imagine what Socrates, if you know the critical things that Socrates said and a few critical incidents from his life, you can imagine the rest. And as far as the Greeks are concerned, that's all that deserves. It doesn't deserve any more than that. If you fill a book full of, what Socrates ate for breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day for a year, a modern historian might find that very interesting because of what they could squeeze out of it about the material culture of the Greeks. But the Greeks couldn't care less. They would never want to read that. They want to read the sayings and a few critical moments from their life. And the rest of it, they know they can make up the rest of it themselves. So this is the way that Burt and Mac suggests that we understand the relationship between Q1 and Q2. So now I'm going to come back to what Stephen said. John the Baptist prepares the way. That wasn't in Q1. That was added later, right? In Q1, it's just a sayings collection. But 5 to 10 years later, they start adding these biographical historical moments that are designed to set up and frame and underscore the importance of why you should listen to the things that Jesus is saying, the older Q1 layer. There's no evidence that John the Baptist did from this Q1, Q2 material. If this was all you had to go on, if you didn't have any other material, and you understood it the way modern scholars do, you'd have to conclude that you can't use Q to confirm that John the Baptist did prepare the way and did preach and did say these things, because that wasn't there originally. That was added later. And it was added later for rhetorical purposes to serve the magnification of the importance of the sayings. It's one of the ways they do literary analysis on the New Testament. They're always looking at, did the person say this because it was true, or did the person say this because they had a rhetorical flourish they were trying to accomplish, and they needed this moment to happen to underscore the thing that they cared about? So in Mark, there's a number of things that happen that revolve around a theme that scholars have worked out that's in Mark. It's called the messianic secret. And it's one of the things that makes Mark totally different from Matthew and Luke, and a million miles away from John. In John, Jesus won't stop talking about he's the light and the truth and the way. He's telling everybody who will listen, I'm the Messiah, I'm the prophet. But in Mark, he won't tell anybody. He's like, shh, it's a secret. And when his followers try to blab to the people at large, hey, it's Jesus the prophet, Mark's Jesus browbeats them. Shut up, you idiots. I'm not here to tell everybody how great I am. I don't really want them to know. It's only for those with eyes to see and ears to hear. Nobody else deserves to know this. And so there are a number of things that happen in Mark that scholars think, well, that's probably not biographical, because that thing that happened serves Mark's plot of the messianic secret. In the same way, Matthew is really concerned with, Christians have to follow all of Jewish law, all of it. If you convert as an adult and you're a man, I'm sorry, you got to chop off the end of your penis. You have to. That's the law. That's what Matthew wants. And so Matthew has Jesus do and say all kinds of things that reinforce that he has not come to overturn the law, but to fulfill it. And meanwhile, there's Paul going, absolutely not. Jesus absolutely does not want you going around, chopping the end off your penis just because you want to be a Christian. You only have to, believe in the kerygma, the salvation. You have to recognize that Jesus is your Lord and Savior, and that, it's going to make things great. That's the focus. These guys don't agree with each other about some core things, and they're adjusting the story to make their core argument stronger. And those are the things that the scholars look at and go, if Luke is saying a very Lukey thing and none of the other gospels say it and Paul doesn't say it and Q doesn't say it, then it probably didn't really happen. It's probably Luke just, sharpening his axe, making his argument. If John says a particularly Johnny thing that nobody else says, and it's not just a biographical detail, but it really reinforces John's core concerns, then it's probably something John made up in order to strengthen his argument. And so they do this to try to sift apart which are the things that are probably fragments from Jesus's actual life, because they don't serve a rhetorical purpose, and which are the things that are part of putting your thumb on the scales and trying to win the argument. And this is why this book by Burton Mack is so interesting. And it's why he likes Q so much. He says, because Q is one of the few places where we can clearly see three different layers of the development of these early Christian movements. And we can compare and contrast those three layers with other early things like Paul, which are radically different. Clearly, Paul's from a different Christian community than the Q1 people are. And you can contrast it with Mark and with Matthew and Luke and see how Mark keeps some things and throws out others in pursuit of the things that he wants to say, whereas Matthew and Luke take more of Q into themselves, and yet they still disagree with each other about which part of Q to take and how to wield it. He says it gives you a way to reveal the concerns of the authors and the communities that they're a part of. And if it doesn't help us to get closer to Jesus, in the way that we expected it to, it does help us get closer to the early Christians and to see who these groups were and what they were worried about. Right? So what Stephen was talking about, apocalypse, becomes a major concern after the Romans invade and destroy the temple. I mean, after that, apocalypse is like one of the dominant themes that people are going to write about. But before the Romans do that, you read the Q1 layer, it's pretty good natured. I mean, it is sort of Diogenes-like in the way that it's wisdom literature kind of poking at convention, but there's a confidence that it is safe to go out into the marketplace and confront people about their beliefs and whether they're being hypocrites. And that's not something you do if you're scared for your life. That's something you do if you're in a reasonably coherent community that has a certain amount of personal freedom and tolerance, like Galilee would have been before the coming of the Romans. So it's interesting, right? We get these kind of ways to look in at. I mean, Donna says in the chat, so interesting. That's exactly how I feel when I'm reading this stuff. It's a way to kind of look at the evolution of the theology and the changes over time. And this goes to what Sharon said when we very first started the medieval section a year ago. And she said, you can see the difference between Jesus trying to teach you to be a good human being and the medieval church trying to teach you to obey and trying to get you under control, trying to manipulate kings and the peasants. We'll talk more about it next week. We're gonna turn to Kenneth Smith's words for the rest of today, but next week we'll really start talking about how the selection of which materials ended up in the canon and which ones were excluded had a lot to do with the bishops trying to establish their authority and apostolic succession to prove that you should listen to them. You can see how over time the concerns change as the material conditions of the church change, as its pressures from Rome or from the Gnostics or from splinter movements that are arguing over who's going to be the biggest bishop. This stuff affects how they interpret what Jesus said and how they augment it with their own materials to try to strengthen their position. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, piggybacking on what you just said, I think it's quite phenomenal that given the different interpretations, the different versions, and the different subject matter, that Christianity became a unifying entity. That is very phenomenal.
It is.
It's just interesting to watch how it occurred.
Yes.
Because not everybody believed the same thing. Not everybody behaved the same way. And I wonder if that's why the Catholic Church came out of the medieval period, and it appointed a pope who decided what you're going to believe and who you're going to pray to. And he was going to be the filter for your transgressions. He or his advocates. So that is what I think came out of all this uncertainty, indecisiveness, differing opinions.
Yes. It's gonna become a major theme going forward is whose word can you trust about how to interpret Jesus's message? And the shift to the bishops and then the shift from the bishops to the Pope, it really goes hand in hand with the adoption by Constantine. If you're going to be an imperial religion, the emperor doesn't have any patience for a whole bunch of squabbling bishops who all disagree with each other. It can't have all these you just can't have those splinter movements. You've got to have a coherent message so that the emperor doesn't have to waste his time in theological debate. It becomes a major concern. Whereas early on, going to your question about how did it become this kind of Catholic religion that's for everybody, this is a theme that's hinted at in the Q1 to Q2 transition. It's hinted at in the history of Galilee, and it's going to become a major theme next week. And that is, if Jesus didn't start in Judea as a devout Jew, if he started in Galilee as one of these cosmopolitan crossroads people who, yeah, he had some Judaism, but he also had some Greek philosophy. He also had some Persian philosophy. He also had Phoenician ideas. He had Syrian and Arabic. He had all these different influences on him. And if the communities that are forming in Galilee they're not a monoculture. They're not all Greeks. They're not all Jews. They're not all Romans. They're instead a melting pot. Then the teachings of Jesus might have originally been motivated by what the Catholic Church was later interested in, which is how do you get a bunch of different people from different backgrounds to work together as a community? And it might have been that that's why it was Galilee and not, say, Jerusalem, where this religion arises that becomes focused on, well, what if you're not all Jews? What if only some of you are Jews? What if some of you are Greek? What if some of you are Persian? How can you live together and work together and be a community? The picture of Galilee that Burton Mack paints, it really makes a lot of sense out of that later history. So Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I reject this interpretation because you're rejecting John the Baptist. You're saying he's virtually a later invention.
No, I'm saying this incorrectly then. That Q doesn't tell us that John is a later invention. What Q tells us is that we can't use Q as evidence for John. That John's existence, John could completely exist, and there could be other testimony for him. But this isn't the place. This isn't the spot that tells us about John.
Yeah, why I say from the very beginning, or the beginning of I'm saying, John is the beginning of the Christianity, which it wasn't at the time. Nobody's going to be talking about Christianity when John's baptizing. And I'm claiming basically he's preaching the end of the world, and you can drop it all. Forget about that donkey. Yeah. Forget about that. Forget about that. Forget about your enemies. Forget about the guy who's trying to kill you. Doesn't matter anymore. The judgment day is around the corner. The important thing is to make sure your inner self is in the right condition for the coming of the Lord. Now, I would say this was an apocalyptic cult at the beginning. And what's important about this, if you just go around, you can remember the prophets from Life of Brian. You've got the crazy prophet with the apocalypse. And then you've got the boring prophet at the end, just saying, well, a man lost his son's hammer. And now, if you're going to get a big following very quickly, the one that really works is the end of the world. We've seen that in recent centuries, time and time again. If you preach the end of the world, what you're saying to people is there isn't a rain shack. You can't say, oh, that looks all very nice. Let me say, oh, look, I'll come back in a year's time or something. You'll go, dude, the world could end in a year's time. There's a lot of stuff. I don't know where you're going to put it in Q, but where he's saying, it's like the bride's being ready for the bridegroom. Be ready for its coming. And I'm saying that this was the whole expression from the beginning, that this is a cold out in the wilderness. It's at the opposite end from the temple. They've got a good business going in the temple. If you're saying the end of the world is nigh, where's the business for the temple? We want to keep things turning over. This is how you get the big crowd, and this is what I'm suspicious about. We were taught this Christian story where there's just a small amount of followers at the beginning, and then it grew. Now, if it's apocalyptic from the beginning, you could have had a large crowd, which might have, a lot of them probably dropped out of, say, Jesus got crucified, but then it came back. It penetrated very quickly into the Roman worlds, possibly, if it's true that the Christians appeared as a significant group in Rome at the time of Nero, because this is something that's going to appeal. Oh, you're not just talking to the Jews, you're going to the Greeks, you're going to everybody. Hey, dude, the end of the world is nigh. Change your ways. There's no rain checks. You're not coming back next week, dude. Well, maybe if you're lucky, it could be any moment. You have to be ready. Doesn't matter if you're a Greek or a Jew any longer. The Lord's coming down. There will be no Greeks or Jews any longer. There'll be just those that are good with God and those that get cast into the fire. Now, I mean, we've seen these movements in the last couple of centuries, and they will draw the big crowds. And I'm thinking, yeah, when Jesus came to Jerusalem in that last year, there was a big crowd with him. And that's why they wanted to lop off the head of the movement. If he had just been the boring prophet in the wilderness, the authorities wouldn't give a damn. But if he had a big crowd, dangerous. Anyway, I better shut up. Thank you.
No, it's fine, Stephen. And what you've underscored is that there's something I did a better job on last time we met than I did this time, which is to emphasize that the Q community doesn't represent the one true original group of Christians. What the Q community represents is one early Jesus movement. And we know that we've got the Thomas group, and they're separate. They're a separate group from the Q folks because they don't have a lot of sayings in common, only a few. They heard different things. And at the same time, we've got Paul's movement. And Paul's movement is completely different from either Thomas or Q. I mean, Paul has almost none of the wisdom sayings anywhere in him. He's very, as Sharon points out, he's very focused on how to set up the churches. He's focused on the salvation. And that's the charisma is his focus, the charisma in the church. And so the point of this isn't to say that one of them is the one true early Christianity. It's to say the earliest evidence we have of Christianity, contrary to the official position, is not that there was a single unified group with one shared set of ideas. Within 10 years of Jesus having died, we are seeing evidence of at least half a dozen different groups that have completely different interpretations of Jesus. And one of those groups is exactly what you're saying, Stephen. There's the apocalyptic movement, and that continues up through John. Even though John, as a gospel, is written last, the conclusion a lot of scholars have reached is that it represents not a sequel to Mark, Matthew, and Luke, but rather an independent community with an independent tradition that includes leading into the apocalypse, the things that you're talking about.
Well, the big point is when he says, supposedly in the Bible, within your generation.
Yes.
And you got to think now that it doesn't really look like that the kingdom of the Lord didn't come within their generation. And yet that's remained in the Bible.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Exactly. And I'm going to call on Sharon in just a second. But to close out this point of where I'm agreeing with you, Stephen, to close out this point is what we see in the evidence is that our picture of Jesus's life is the result of weaving together a bunch of separate stories that had separate concerns, and we sort of synergized them to make a unified gospel out of the gospels and the epistles and these extra canonical sources. But the farther back we go into the literary analysis, the more we find not a unified picture, but a number of serious disagreements about who Jesus was and what he represented. And the apocalyptic strand you're talking about is definitely an early community.
Well, for the Greco-Romans, their gods, old gods, our gods don't die, they merely fade away.
Right. Right.
And this is something completely different. You get these Jew guys coming along, hey, dude, it's all happening.
Yes. Yes. So I think you'll get a kick out of next week when we're gonna talk about more of these alternatives and how they influenced each other. But basically, scholars agree the apocalyptic strand is very early. It's just the Q people don't know anything about it at first in Q1. They add it later. Sharon, go ahead.
I want to make a very quick point here that John the Baptist and John the Apostle are two different people. when it comes to teaching, John the Baptist makes a big entrance for the baptism of Jesus with his apocalyptic declarations, and then he kind of fades away. So I just want to make that point.
It's an important point. Yeah. I didn't distinguish them clearly in what I was just saying, but you're absolutely right.
I think John the Baptist was beheaded. He didn't live to old age. So
yeah.
I don't know how much teaching he did.
Yeah.
But he came with his declaration of the apocalypse. I can't say that word. The end of the apocalypse, and then he kind of faded away.
Yeah. Yeah, especially in Mark. Mark offers the of the four canonical gospels, Mark offers the least details about John's life after he serves his purpose early on, and then Mark just sort of sweeps him off stage. We learn more about him from Matthew and Luke and John, the other John, the the gospel writer. Yes, you're right. We have a problem, and the problem is even worse with the name Mary or Maria or Mara, because I guess current estimates are based on the evidence we have. Half of all women were named Mary or some variant of Mary around Jesus's time. It was just a really popular name. And boy, does that make it hard now to go back and try to figure out, are these two Marys the same Mary? What about that Mary? Is that a third Mary or the different Mary or the same Mary later? There's been endless struggle to try to figure out how many people are we talking about here. But generally speaking, John the Baptist, John the writer of the gospel, and John of Patmos, who wrote the Apocalypse, probably three different people. But the later two Johns, John the gospel writer and John of Patmos, who might have written the Apocalypse, they appear to those works appear to have been shared within the same John community. It's just a coincidence that there's these two different Johns who wrote different works that ended up in the canonical Bible. But it was the same group that was interested in both of them, and that's part of why they all end up in the Bible, is part of that weaving together. Ariel, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I just had I guess a few comments and then a couple questions to the group, especially those who are, I guess, still practicing Christians or teachers of Christianity. So as far as the different competing denominations and stuff, it just seems to me that Christianity from the beginning was a danger, right, to those who held power. And, first, getting rid of Jesus, who was, its greatest prophet. I have trouble saying Son of God, but I'm not a Christian. So, but at any rate, what I'm getting at is that from the beginning, there was this controversy over Christianity, and then finally the Romans made it, Roman theocracy, and said, okay, we're going to get behind this. But then it seems to me like this always happens with religions that become very popular and sort of pose a threat to the powers that be. They take it on and say, but this, they have that council and they decide, this is what you're going to believe. This is what you're going to do with this religion. This is, with our stamp of approval. So it becomes Roman theocracy. So number one, how do Christians feel about that history? That the fact that what they've been given is not probably Jesus's true intent, but a Roman theocracy, number one. Number two, how do you feel about the fact that Muhammad went, completely the opposite direction and said, oh no, this is not going to happen to us. We're going to make it militant. We're going to make it theocracy. And then in general, if you could just speak to how all religions, maybe if you even want to include, now there's Zen Buddhism, there's the different kind of Buddhism. So is it not a control mechanism and maybe even a rebellion that that these different denominations and different interpretations occur. That's all.
Thanks, Ariel. Well, you've given us an armload of questions that could take a year to answer, or a doctorate in theology. These are the right questions. I don't mean to be dismissive. They're the thing. You're asking the questions that matter the most. The problem is that answering them is very hard. And part of the reason is that Christianity is many different things to many different people. One of the points that Burton Mack is making, and I'm making in this opening, today, is the idea that even right after Jesus's death, people have taken his life and teachings in completely different directions. And so it makes it hard to generalize about what Christianity is. And the temptation to generalize is very strong because in the Middle Ages, among other things, you get crusades and inquisitions and some really big world affecting things. And so one wants to say, well, then this must be what it is. But part of the proposition that we have as we're going through this medieval section of Millennia and Microcosm is the idea that we can't actually do that. We can say that maybe the powers that be in medieval Europe, they envisioned a religious empire and they pursued it vigorously. But that only works if we harness it in a dialectic to the alternative, which is at the exact same time that was happening, you had other people like Hilda of Whitby, Hildegard von Bingen, Joan of Arc. You had countless writers and nuns and desert fathers and mothers, and spiritual mystics, who took Christianity in an entirely different direction than the powers that be of the medieval era. And frequently people weren't being persuaded or converted by the sword. It's not that it didn't happen; it did plenty. But frequently they were being converted by these alternative mystics and nuns and monks and friars. These people who were saying these really brotherhood of man. Let's all love one another. Let's take care of one another. We must do away with the corruption and try to be true to Jesus' message. That's highly appealing to a lot of people who would never sign on to, I want to be a warrior of Christ and go kill the infidel. I mean, you know what I mean? So there is what Sharon raised when we started the medieval section, talking about Christianity used as a tool of control, a tool of empire, is certainly present at a level of kind of religious political merging, but it's often outright rejected by some of the most influential mystical writers from the Christian era, some of whom were busy talking to their Jewish and Islamic compatriots about what is the nature of God, what is the nature of spirit, what is the nature of love, having exactly the sorts of discussions that an emperor or a pope would rather they weren't having. And don't talk to those people, fight them, kill them, beat them, convert them. And instead you've got these people going, no, man, in fact, I like this whole university thing they're doing over there. I think we should have universities. Let's all learn things. No, it's like there is a dialectic here. There's a tug of war, and it continues to the current day. There are people who try to wield Christianity in a genocidal way and say there's only one right religion, and furthermore, there's only one right flavor of that religion, and we should use the U.S. military to conquer the world and make everybody our flavor of Christian. I mean, that movement is a real movement in the United States. But side by side, you've got ecumenical and interfaith versions of Christianity that are absolutely opposed to that, and that are all about free thought, and that your pursuit of spirituality should be unhampered by military or any other coercive form. And we sort of are in a position where we can't say that either one of them is the authentic Christianity. They're both part of it. There's a struggle for the soul of Christianity and what it means and what it represents. And that struggle is almost more defining of the religion than either of the poles. Go ahead and come off mute again, Ariel. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, it just struck me that it's almost like the sword that's used against you, right? In a way. So, they had this big thing, advertising cybersecurity. They spent all this money and scholarship, trying to get people into cybersecurity. And I went into it for a while. And I'm thinking that, I'm going to be protecting Americans and I'm going to be doing good things, for Americans. But it's actually anybody who knows anything about cybersecurity, especially if you're working in an organization, the people you're spying on are internal. So, yeah. So leading back to religion and to Kenneth, with the Inquisitions and things like that, who is the good Christian, right? Are you a good Christian or a bad Christian? And if you're a bad Christian, should you be punished? It strikes me as the whole thing is it in some ways, some of these denominations or religions, I'm not saying all, I was brought up Christian, but in some ways, do they weaponize it in a way? Weaponize it not for the good, but again, to look at their own and criticize and say, are you a good one or a bad one? Should we kick you out or should we make you do, penance for your past? Just a thought. It struck me because it seems like some of these things that we get into and we think we're getting into something good and powerful that's going to elevate us, and instead we get stuck in the mire of a mudslinging.
Yes. Yes. It's this is one of the most interesting things about the medieval epoch as a field of study, is the way that it's not possible to reduce it to one or the other without distorting it. We want it to be simpler than it is. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Or can we just average them and say it's somewhere in the middle? But it's absolutely not averageable, because the Christians who, wanted to conquer the world are a different group of people than the Christians who absolutely did not want to conquer the world and were opposed to that and wanted to, do good works and be kind to the poor and so on. And they existed at the exact same time, and they both claimed the title of Christian. And we're not in a position to be able to say, well, one of them is right and one of them is wrong. Your concept of Christianity, any of our concepts of Christianity, if we're going to do justice to the whole dialectic of the thing, it means we have to acknowledge that on the one hand, we have Torquemada, leading the Inquisition, which is a horror. Most people don't know Torquemada is a Basque, and the Spanish Inquisition was mainly directed against Basque country. Yes, it was everywhere, and yes, they went after, Jews who said they converted but didn't, and there's all kinds of horrible things that happened. But 75% or more of the cruelty of the Spanish Inquisition was directed against Basque country, right on the border with France. And that was the place where there were more people who kept the old pre-Christian and frankly pre-Indo-European ways of life. The wise women who acted as midwives, and mythology about snakes and fiery bulls in caves and all kinds of stuff. They still believed that stuff in Basque Country. Now it's almost been exterminated. You can find stories of Basque legends, but the Inquisition really destroyed that. And the horrible thing is that the guy who led that charge was a Basque man. Torquemada was a Basque, and he converted and then wielded this thing in this horrible terror against not only Jews and Muslims but his own mountain people. And that's a horror. And if you look at that and you think, well, I mean, that's just evil, right? I mean, it's just awful. But then you've got Martin Luther King Jr. And Martin Luther King Jr. did an enormous amount of good in the world. I mean, an enormous amount of good. And although I've heard atheists try to say, well, he would have done those things even if he wasn't a Christian. I'm like, well, you haven't studied the man's life. I mean, his role in his church, his upbringing in his church, his relationship to other churches, that was the network of social justice, in the Black liberation movement in the South. It wasn't an atheist movement that happened to have some Christians along. It was a Christian movement that was in direct opposition to another Christian movement that was trying to enforce racism and terrorism and lynching against Black people. I mean, both groups were Christian. And that's what we're stuck with. And I don't think it's a problem if we're trying to make a bumper sticker or a little button and a saying on it. But instead of a problem, it is an enormous gateway of revelation and aha experiences if we can take that understanding and apply it to what the ancient world must have been like and apply it to what the modern world must be like now. There are people who hate the modern world, and there are people who love the modern world. The people who love the modern world will tell you everything about that's wrong with the past and all the great strides we've made in the modern era. But the people who hate the modern world will tell you about all the terrible things we've done in the modern world that the other group doesn't want to talk about, that are equally true. They're both true at the same time. There is this ugly irreducibility of the in the complexity of the human condition in any of these epochs. And Christianity, especially medieval Christianity, gives us this fantastic opportunity to see both halves of it at work. So that's why I kind of reiterate, Ariel. I think the questions you're asking are the most important questions, the right questions, and they're the questions we're going to keep going at over the course of the next year and a half while we finish up the medieval epoch. But they don't have a simple answer. The complicated answers they do have really can open our eyes to better understand the human condition now and in the past. It's like there are complicated things, not just complex, but contradictory movements happening at the same time in any of these epochs. And now we're back to Hegel and the dialectic, right? Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I just wanted to share something. I see this Christianity as in two big buckets. One, the faith, the teachings, as challenging as it is to figure out what that is because of the diversity of interpretation that we're talking about. But the second big bucket, and this is where you get on your own personal journey, interdenominational in any denomination of your choosing. But the second big bucket where I think people get lost and I get lost for a while is the implementation. And that has been going on from the medieval times, the wars, the papal indiscretion. All those things are the implementation in which you see human nature, I think. So I always decide which of the buckets I'm going to focus on today. I just wanted to share that.
No, it's right on. And it also goes to the heart between the difference between one of these movements in its early revolutionary period when it's trying to break people free from the shackles of the old corrupt order that has to go, that's making everybody's lives miserable. And then you look at the arc of it and you say, how did power change over time so that this liberating impulse early on, by the end of the epoch, has become its own corruption and its own suffocation, this trap that people have to rebel against to get out of. And a lot of it has to do with that difference you're talking about, Sharon. To what extent are people going through the motions and doing the forms of it? And to what extent are they doing actual inward searching of their own character and their relationships with one another? The criticism that early Christianity has against the ancient world is you say that it's about character. You say that the best characters are supposed to rise to the top. But when we look at the top of the Roman Empire, we see the worst people. We don't see the best. We see the worst, and they're feeding their appetites. So your entire schema for life has an Achilles heel that you don't want to talk about. But we're going to talk about it. We're going to not let anybody forget the corruption of Rome, the city of man, says Augustine in his book, The City of God. We're not going to paper over anymore all of those ways in which the old epoch became a hollowed out shell, going through the motions, using the brand of the things that it stood for in its early revolutionary period to justify late stage corruption, a soullessness, a spiritlessness, that was suffocating humanity. This goes right to the heart of it, and it's part of where early Christianity, part of the revolution in it, is to say it isn't enough to go through the motions. It isn't enough to just have tradition be something that you do, because the lifeblood of tradition is in its value system and the character of the people that it's capable of generating for that culture. If they live a searching life, in which they really question themselves and try to be authentic human beings, then we can have a spiritual revolution and a brotherhood of man. But if they're not willing to search themselves, if they just assume everything they think is true and everything they've ever done is right, then you end up with these empty shells that have to be overthrown, like the late stage Roman Empire. And that's an acute observation. It goes to the heart of what Kenneth says about the way that Christianity tried to replace a kingdom of nature with a kingdom of spirit. It says we really need to look inside in an authentic, searching way that we've never done before. And that was the promise of early Christianity. You know. So Kenneth's text for the last 25 minutes. let's do Kenneth's text. And we'll see how we do. So we're on paragraph 18. This is where I'm just start as I always do. I start with the paragraph that we were on last time so we can remember. For those who weren't here last time, Kenneth's talking about this chapter 8, is about the contradiction between Jesus's teachings and what the medieval power structure created from those teachings. The extent to which, and this is Sharon's interest in this area that she raised early on, to what extent are we being true to Jesus' message versus to what extent are we warping it into a tool of empire? And in the previous sentences and paragraphs, Kenneth has already set up this proposition that the challenge facing not the early church, the house church, that didn't have that problem, but the later church at the time of the bishops, the time of Constantine, now they're at the point of how do we seize the reins of power? How do we convince the political economy to adopt us as their core religion? And how do we grow and get as many people to join as possible? How do we make this not a religion for the few people who are willing to be searching and turn it into a religion for vast numbers of people who aren't willing to be searching? How do we appeal to them? And it describes the shift from blessed are the meek to be good or you go to hell. You might remember last week we talked about Thomas Aquinas and how he said that one of the chief rewards of heaven, one of the main reasons to go to heaven, is so that you can point and laugh at the misery of the people in hell. That's really what heaven consists of. It's you're going to have such a great time enjoying their suffering, and that it's not you, and that it's happening to them. And we talk about how this couldn't be further away from Jesus's teaching, which is if you see a leper, help the leper. If you see someone suffering, go help them, right? That's what you're supposed to do. And so chapter 8 is about how did this happen? How does over time, over the centuries, how does a movement talk itself into this position or get co-opted and used in these ways? So that's where we begin with sentences 3 and 5 here from last week. A Christian may certainly, and he means a medieval Christian, a Christian may certainly want to share the prospects of heaven with others, just as his spirituality will make him altruistic and eager to help men in their worldly afflictions. But both of these godly works only ensure his own place in heaven. In other words, he's talking about the way in which the promise of heaven or the threat of hell corrupts your motivation. You want to be good. Jesus wants you to be good because you should be good. He wants you to help people because you should help people. But when the medieval church starts amplifying these issues of heaven and hell and your soul being at stake in everything you do in every moment, you start searching yourself in a different way. Instead of searching yourself for, am I instead of searching yourself for, am I willing to sacrifice my material interests for the welfare of others, like Jesus would say? Am I instead just trying to rack up points to make sure I end up in the right place after I die? And that is a difficult moral position to put any human being in. Try to be authentic while this threat is hanging over you. This massive, existential, turned up to 11 threat. It's not just that you'll have a bad time, you'll be tortured for eternity. Now, try to have a conversation, an authentic conversation with yourself in which you think about what other people need. And Kenneth's line here is that this is just the medieval power structure, by focusing on heaven and hell, has put people into an extremely difficult ethical position. He says, who gives up that place for the sake of others? Heaven and hell are the pleasure and pain drives of the spirit. They've been forged to appeal ultimately to spiritual self-interest, to give spirit what it most fervently desires. And so to reduce what should be the dilation of one's character and soul under the influence of spirit is instead turned into a transaction. Pay the indulgence, get out of hell. is what it becomes by the 1400s, 1500s. And this is what he's criticizing in here. He's talking about the process by which this change happens. He continues, and now we're getting into sentences we didn't do last time. And I made just a single sentence because, man, it's a doozy. It's a typical Kenneth sentence. These twinned ideas of eternal reward and punishment are meant to redesign religion, i.e. redesign Jesus's religion into the Christian religion, for the sake of those douloi driven not by what is right in itself, but by their own appetites, purportedly to modulate those appetites from natural to spiritual. I'll do the second clause in a moment, but this is where he's talking about, you know, he said last time we met, we went through his sentences where he talked about if Jesus is promulgating a religion for those with eyes to see and ears to hear, he's focusing on people who have heuristic potential. Are you willing to question yourself? Are you willing to maybe give up the things that you want or the things you like to think in order to do the right thing? Are you willing to roll the boulder up the hill? Are you willing to do the work of self-cultivation? But if the church doesn't want to be a religion for a minority, if it wants to be a religion for everybody, then it has to be a religion that can appeal to the other two modes of life, to people who are parochial and appetitive, motivated by fear and desire, on the one hand, the douloi, under the Greek model, or on the other hand, people who are living overly intellectualized ideological lives in which they've been trained and educated into seeing the world in ideological terms. And they, you know, at their best, they subscribe to a moral philosophy that they follow rigidly, but at their worst, they don't subscribe to any philosophy at all other than, you know, how do I get ahead? How do I get what I want? How can I manipulate others to get the things that I desire? They become entirely transactional. And so Kenneth finishes the sentence by saying, these venal ideas indeed got modified further by late medieval Catholic indulgences so as to reduce the terms of the afterlife to a commodity and a transaction. For the sake of the banausoi, and these are the transactional, ideologized noetic personalities, those who know no value but exchange value. And exchange value, of course, is going to become the critical term of the modern era. Late medieval leads directly into the modern era. So he's talking about this problem. You know, to what extent are we trying to scare or reward people appetitively, emotionally, experientially, parochially into doing what we want, as Sharon alluded to earlier? And to what extent are we trying to bribe people transactionally into doing what we want? You know, give money to start up monasteries or cathedrals, and the Pope will say that you are the anointed king, right? Which was alluded to earlier in the comments. You know, to what extent are the religious authorities acting as genuine spiritual shepherds for the political authorities, on the one hand, versus to what extent do they devolve into a transactional marketplace of, you know, buy your way out of hell and into heaven? And so just give enough, pay enough to have enough nuns sing enough time, you know, and your soul will make it out of heaven, out of hell, no matter how bad you were in life. We'll let you out as a transaction. And as Kenneth is pointing out, these are both very corrupting ways to think about the teachings of Jesus, regardless of whether Jesus was an apocalyptic, going to Stephen's comment, regardless of whether Jesus was an apocalyptic teacher or not. His focus wasn't, I need to set up an institution that's going to, you know, use coinage, pseudo-spiritual coinage in order to manipulate people to do what a king wants or what a pope wants or what have you. It completely erases the revolutionary qualities of Jesus's teachings and replaces them with a simple leash. One kind of leash for douloi, a different kind of leash for banausoi. But in any case, the thing that Sharon was concerned about, a devolved form, a despiritualized form of spirituality that goes through the motions but doesn't involve the actual searching qualities, the actual, what the Greeks would call the actual anthropocultural qualities that make it possible to cultivate a better character and become a better person than you are when you start out. If all you're doing is paying cash to get out of hell, nothing about that makes you a better person. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I think, I mean, that you actually just took what I was about to say, in the sense that it's a, it should be, even if you were to take this idea of something that you have a relationship with something bigger than yourself, and that relationship then enables you to recognize why you're doing something in the first place. And you replace that with the idea of an institution. And, and then now the relationships with the institution versus the actual main intent. So when Kenneth says in here, you're no longer doing it for what is right in itself. That's what happens. It starts to be the relationship with, well, I'm doing it for a transactional purpose. And, that's both torturous in a number of ways. I mean, one, if people are able to get to a point where they're actually acting in a way where they see the value in their behavior in and of itself, or an act, they're not tied to an outcome. And that's really key, because that's true freedom. When you have that, when you're no longer, in this case, you're really tied to the outcome. And in fact, this is the outcomes being told that, this is, you don't do this, it's going to be really, it's not going to be the best consequence. You're going to have serious consequences. And I think that that's really an important thing, because a lot of times people then lose, they lose the ability to actually have any kind of resilience. And when I say that, it's even if you're not looking for the reward of heaven or hell, you're continuous looking for a reward of some sort. I mean, in this case, and when you're doing it only for the reward, and that's not to say that, like, that people don't have a rewarding feeling for doing the right thing, but that's a very different approach, because if you feel rewarded for doing the right thing, then you walk away no matter what. You're feeling you did the right, that what you did was appropriate. But on the flip side of that would be like, okay, I did something right, what are you going to do for me now? And that makes it transactional. And when I say that it's resilient, in the sense that if I'm doing it for the right thing, the thing in and of itself is that you can walk away, you'll do it again because it's its own reward. So that's what happens when, and with the relationship with, and this is what, that's what happens when a relationship is with an institution and fellow man versus even God and fellow man, or even something bigger than yourself, fellow man. Like, kind of, there's this element of that. So, and so I think that's one of the important parts to kind of recognize, is that how it kind of almost speaks to our desires, and how it actually weakens the ability to do it, to be resilient, I should say.
That's an excellent point, Joe. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the problems that we see occurring over and over throughout these epochs, is that none of them has successfully come up with a motive. And this goes to what Stephen says in the comments too. None of them has successfully come up with the reason to be good that can hold water when the pressure's taken off. So if you're good because I'm offering you a carrot or a stick, then what do you do when I'm not there with a carrot or a stick? Right? Now there's no transaction. And so people who are raised in those kinds of over-controlling environments, they often go wild when the control is taken off. You see all these, kids gone wild college videos, The people who lived in over-controlling environments get away from it for the very first time in their life, and they go berserk. And it's because they have no real morality. Their character itself was not cultivated. They were just kept in a leash. And the moment the leash is off, now what do? They don't know. They don't know what they're supposed to do. So the medieval critique of the ancient world is that, and now I'm going to directly answer Stephen's question because he's asking the most important question. In some ways, it's the most important question of the entire book. And what is to make us be good? And Kenneth's first answer is in each epoch, there is a completely different answer to what is the good. How do you decide what good is? And in the ancient world, you decide what good is by studying nature. What is it that makes it possible for this species to live its way of life, woven into the larger ecosystem in a sustainable way, so that the individual member of that species can survive, and the rest of the species benefits from that behavior as well. And so does the whole ecosystem, so that the longer the species acts, the longer it can act. It's got a feedback loop, a positive feedback loop that aids its survival. And of course, Aristotle ties this all to arete. What are your core excellences? Right? That if you pursue those excellences, it will allow you and drive you to live the healthy, sustainable life that you are meant to live. And their critique is the problem is human beings don't have one of those. We're the man with 1,000 masks. We can be too many different things. We don't have one clear set of answers. And aside from the 1,000 things we could be, are 10 million things that we can't be, but that we can't tell apart from the 1,000 things we could be. We're not able to distinguish what are viable ways of life from non-viable ways of life. And this is our struggle. And that the ancients say, so what we have to do is we have to study our existential condition and come up with, what is the way of life we're going to try to pursue? What are its excellences? And what are the arete that we need to practice in order to live that life successfully? And the Christian critique is, it all sounds good, but man, you gave us Caligula. I mean, if you had it figured out, there would not have been a Caligula in charge of the Roman Empire. So you do not have it figured out. Your definition of the good only holds water for a little while, and then it all runs out, and we're left with this corruption. So we have a new definition, say the medievals. And this goes to the heart of this is to help Stephen understand what it was I was trying to say earlier, but not saying well. The medieval proposition is very simple. You can't trust people. To err is human. People are fallible. People should not be governed by other people. There is only one infallible source of goodness and truth in the cosmos, and that source is God. God is all good. He would never steer us wrong. And God is all-knowing and all-powerful. He knows what we should do. And he knows what we should do that is the good thing to do. And so what we need to do is reorganize our political economy to turn over this decision-making to God. That's what's good. What's good is not what the humanists like or don't like. What's good is not, some particular recipe. What's good is not, the character of the superior man. What's good is what God tells us to do, because God is good. And so all we have to do is organize our religion and our political economy to make sure we have a clear, unfiltered, undistorted channel of wisdom coming to us directly from God. And then we can have peace on earth, and corruption will be no more. That's the promise. That's what the entire medieval epoch is about. That's even the corrupt people had to pretend to believe this. This is the core proposition. And when people were corrupt, it's why an illiterate peasant from the backwaters of France could rise up and rise to power and lead armies to victories against the English invaders, because everybody could see that she was acting as a purer conduit of God's will than the actual French authorities. That's what they were looking for. And they could recognize it in her and say, there is the good. That's what we want to follow. She's an empty vessel for a greater wisdom. And that greater wisdom is the good that we want to follow. And what Kenneth's trying to say, and what I was trying imperfectly to say earlier in this call, is that's the corruption that Kenneth is talking about when he says, when you warp the teachings so that you're no longer an open conduit from Jesus, but instead you are now changing it to say, how can I, Rick, as Pope, get people to do what I want? Or how can I, as King Rick, get the English people to do what I want? How can I scare them into it? How can I bribe them into it? All of these things involve not just slight distortions, but really fundamental betrayals of the message of Jesus, whether you believe it's apocalyptic originally or not. So
Yeah. Can
Go
I
ahead,
just add one quick thing is that, I mean, and this is where there's another misconception, and I was just, kind of thinking back to something, and that I'd come across is that the idea of how power and dominance essentially lead to some kind of harmony, and that's what essentially what this is saying. And when you said people aren't supposed to be governing people, that's pretty much one of the one of the things that I think that would it enable a certain degree of harmony. And so and the reason I remember thinking about this, it was actually Shakespeare's play Titus Andronicus, and where he says, "Sweet mercy is nobility's true badge," and that essentially, if, and this was the idea of conquering, right? Somebody conquered another people, but how then do you ensure peace? It's not necessarily, by imposing your will or, using, kind of that institutional power, but rather, the real foundations are things that are, like mercy, respect, and a form of restoration of sorts. And that leads to a lasting harmony versus, and the Tao actually covers this as well. The leader is the one that you don't hear about, that people say they did it. And I mean, so there's wisdom, and that's all actually in ancient traditions. But I really think that you hit on something that people are not supposed to necessarily govern people. And that's where things go really sideways, I guess. So,
yeah.
But this is institutional power that's
Yes.
being exacted because of the heaven and hell.
It's certainly core to the medieval value proposition, what you're talking about. And I guess the last part of amplifying Stephen's question there is, the challenge that Kenneth Smith sets for us in this book is to not answer Stephen's question with a single answer. Any single answer we give to it is going to be from the perspective of one epoch's perspective and not from the others. He's saying this is a more difficult question. That's why Stephen's asking the right question. It's a far more difficult question to answer than anybody who thinks they have a quick answer for it. So the most authentic spiritual medieval answer would be, it is not for us to say what is good, because we're human beings. We don't know. The only thing that we know about human beings declaring what the good is that we get it wrong, because behold the Roman Empire. So we don't want our answers to what's good. We want Jesus's answers about what's good. We want God's answers about what's good. And you can find among the writings of the medieval spiritualists, including Jewish spiritualists, including Islamic spiritualists, you find a recurring theme. Sufis write about this, in which they say, please let your will be done, not my will. I want to be a vehicle for your goodness, not to impose my own distorted ideas of right and wrong on the world. Because if I'm in charge, I'll fuck it up. But if you're in charge, it will come out right. Help me open my mind and my heart to whatever it is that you want me to do. That is the most medieval thing you could say spiritually, because it goes to the core criticism of the ancient world. And of course, it's a very non-modern thing to say. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I was meeting, we're having a Zoom meeting, and one of our local atheists was the evangelical atheists, the atheists who believe once we've converted everybody to the true faith, and hey, we're not a religion. Yeah, sure. Yeah, when he mentioned Euphra's dilemma, I thought I could rephrase that for him. So he was smiling. I was being rather nice that day, so sort of happy and smiling. And I gave him, out of the honesty of my heart, I gave him that little bit about, I rephrased the Euphra dilemma. He goes, oh, yeah, he takes it, and then he looks at it for about, a few seconds, and then his face screws up. And he said, of course, the humanists love the good because it is good. And that's actually the wrong answer.
It is the wrong answer. How would you know?
It's good because it is loved by the humanists, and that's the problem, you see. It doesn't matter if you say there's not a God and it's just man. The religion taught that things were good because God made the goodness. And the atheists say things are good because man created the goodness. But who are these madmen that are talking about a goodness that is independent of agency?
Right.
I question that one. I don't know the full answer. But please, really, people have got to think if they're starting to say that there's a good independence of agency. Because it doesn't matter if you're religious or atheist. In both cases, you're saying there's an agency.
Yes. You're asking the question that trips everybody up. And even if they don't recognize they're being tripped, like with the group you were talking to, you can see that they're being tripped up by it. They're making a circular argument that they think is objective, right? They think when they say we like it because it's good, they're missing the fact that, well, how is it that they have the claim to know what's good? Right? Where's
Because
that?
the
They're skipping
authority
that
told
part.
me so.
Right. They're
The
just
Pope
skipping
told
right
me what
past it.
good was.
Yes.
Therefore, I received it as an object.
Yes.
But it wasn't originally an object. It was
That's
a subject of the Pope.
That's right. That's right. I mean,
Another little angle, there's that old warning to me, God, man, and nature. That remember, we had the supernatural, we had the natural, and we have anthropomorphism, man. Anthropomorphism that says, the creatures in nature are all cute little fluffy bunny rabbits, and none of them will hurt you. Okay, look, we got rid of the supernatural. We threw God out of the picture. That left nature and man. But the same people that threw God out of the picture are now trying to throw nature out of the picture. This is when you start to think, hey, dude, what's going on here? You're saying there isn't. Jesus, the God, we've thrown Jesus, the God, out, leaving Jesus, the natural man. And now they're saying the natural man never existed. Do you see where this is going? Thank you.
yes. These are totally the right questions. These are millennial questions that raise issues of worldview and epochs and they go to the challenges. It's so easy to ask the question, what is the good? But it's so hard to do justice to it. The example, the conversation you described, there's a phrase in English called begging the question. Almost everybody gets the definition wrong now. We used to know what it meant. We think begging the question means raising the question or suggesting the question or making it imperative to ask the question. But that's not it at all. Begging the question is when somebody asks you a question and instead of answering it authentically, you answer it by assuming that the answer you like is true. And if the answer you like is true, then the following would follow. But that is just evaded the point of why you asked the question in the first place. When you say, how do you know that what you love is actually good? How do you know it's not just that you think it's good because it's what you think? Their answer literally begged the question. They just assumed that they know what's good, which was your point, but which they totally missed. They managed to completely miss one of the most important questions they'll ever encounter in their life, and it was right in front of them, but they couldn't see it because of the way their ideology was constructed as a circle. It excluded the enormous yawning abyss of one of the most important philosophical questions in history, which you gave them and they just missed this. And they didn't miss it because they're dumb. They missed it because they're intelligent, but they're possessed by an ideology. And this is where we all are, Kenneth Smith says. We all struggle with the ideologies that possess us. And the purpose of this book is to shake us up enough to realize that and start to be able to notice the questions that we've been skipping over all our lives. So I hope you all had a good time. I certainly did. We'll pick this up again next week. We'll start to get into the stuff Stephen was talking about. When does the apocalyptic stuff? How do those threads work in here? And we'll go further. I think we can wrap up this chapter next week of Kenneth Smith.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Happy holidays.
Oh, that's right. Happy holidays. Yeah.
Merry Christmas to myself.
Yeah.
Merry
Take care,
Christmas,
everyone.
Sharon.
See you all next time.
Yeah, Merry Christmas.
See
Take care,
you all
everybody.
next week.
Bye-bye.
Okay.